Mu, the lost continent beneath the waves, a civilization that never was, or a truth the world forgot. Somewhere beneath the vast, endless blue of the Pacific Ocean, there may lie the ruins of a civilization older than Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than anything recorded in the history books we were handed as children. A motherland of humanity. A paradise of 64 million souls, masters of science, art, architecture, and spiritual wisdom, swallowed in a single catastrophic night by fire, earthquake, and the merciless sea. Its name was Mu, and for nearly a century the story of this lost continent has haunted the edges of human imagination, blurring the line between history and myth, between science and longing, between what we know and what we desperately wish were true. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is something in the human soul that refuses to believe the past is fully known. We look at the pyramids of Giza and wonder. We stand before the stone heads of Easter Island and ask questions no textbook has ever fully answered. We trace the strange, haunting similarities between civilizations separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, civilizations that, according to every accepted timeline, should never have known each other existed, and we feel it, that quiet, persistent whisper that says there is something missing from the story. Something enormous, something deliberately forgotten or accidentally lost beneath the weight of millennia. It is in that gap, in that space between the known and the unknown, that the legend of Mu was born, and what a legend it is. Mu, sometimes called the Motherland, sometimes called the lost continent of the Pacific, is one of the most extraordinary claims ever made about the deep past of our species. According to its most famous champion, a man named James Churchward, Mu was not merely an island or a small landmass, it was a continent. A vast, sprawling territory stretching across the Pacific Ocean, roughly 5,000 miles from east to west and 3,000 miles from north to south. It was home, Churchward insisted, to a civilization that flourished more than 50,000 years ago, a civilization so advanced, so spiritually enlightened, so architecturally and scientifically accomplished that every great culture known to recorded history was merely a pale echo of its glory. Egypt, according to Churchward, was a colony of Mu. The great civilizations of India drew their sacred knowledge from Mu. The mysterious builders who erected the colossal statues on Easter Island were descendants of Mu. The Maya, the Inca, the builders of every ancient wonder that has ever made us pause and question, all of them, Churchward declared, owed their genius to this single, magnificent source. And then in a cataclysm of unimaginable violence, Mu was destroyed. The earth beneath it collapsed. The gas chambers that had supported its landmass from below were emptied in a geological convulsion, and the entire continent sank beneath the waves of the Pacific. 64 million people perished in a single night. The greatest civilization the world had ever known was erased from the surface of the earth, leaving behind only scattered survivors, fragmented memories, and cryptic symbols carved in stone on islands and coastlines around the world. It is a breathtaking story. It is a story that has captured the imagination of millions, and it is a story that, by the standards of modern geology, archaeology, oceanography, and linguistics, is almost certainly not true. But the story of Mu is not simply a tale about a lost continent. It is a story about us, about the human need for origins. About the desire to believe that somewhere, at some point in the unrecorded past, humanity achieved something perfect, something golden, something that we have since fallen away from and might, with enough knowledge and enough seeking, recover. The story of Mu is the story of how pseudoscience is born, how it grows, how it seduces intelligent and well-meaning people, and how, even after it has been thoroughly debunked, it refuses to die. To understand Mu, we must begin not with the continent itself, but with the men who invented it. And to understand those men, we must first understand the world they lived in, a world intoxicated by discovery, dizzy with empire, and desperately searching for a grand narrative that could explain the bewildering diversity and mysterious similarities of the ancient world. Chapter 1. The Age of Lost Worlds. The 19th century was, above all else, the century of discovery. Not just geographical discovery, though that was staggering enough, the mapping of Africa's interior, the charting of the Pacific's remotest islands, the penetration of jungles and deserts and mountain ranges that had been, to European eyes, utterly unknown, but intellectual discovery as well. The 19th century was the era in which the deep past of humanity was, for the first time, truly opened up. Consider what happened in the span of a single human lifetime. At the beginning of the 1800s, the history of the world, as understood by educated Europeans, began essentially with the Greeks and the Hebrews. The Bible provided the framework. Creation had occurred roughly 6,000 years earlier. The flood of Noah had reshaped the earth. The scattering of peoples after the Tower of Babel had populated the continents. There was very little sense of deep time, very little awareness of the vast, echoing millennia that stretched back before the first written records. And then, one by one, the doors began to open. In 1799, Napoleon's soldiers in Egypt discovered the Rosetta Stone, and within a generation, Jean-François Champollion had cracked the code of Egyptian hieroglyphics, revealing a civilization that was not merely old but staggeringly old, older than Greece, older than Rome, older than anything Europeans had previously imagined. Suddenly, the past was not a shallow pool but a deep ocean. In the 1840s and 1850s, Austin Henry Layard excavated the ruins of Nineveh in what is now Iraq, unearthing the palaces of the Assyrian kings and the vast library of Ashurbanipal, which contained cuneiform tablets recording myths, laws, and histories that predated the Bible by centuries. Among those tablets was the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its haunting account of a great flood that bore unmistakable similarities to the story of Noah, raising explosive questions about the origins of biblical narratives. In the 1860s, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, shattering the comfortable assumption that humanity had been specially created and suggesting instead that we were the product of a vast, blind, grinding process of natural selection operating over millions of years. The Earth itself, geologists were discovering, was not 6,000 years old but millions, perhaps billions of years old. The past was not merely deep, it was abyssal. And as explorers, archaeologists, and linguists pushed further and further into the unknown, they kept encountering the same maddening puzzle: similarities, striking, uncanny, seemingly impossible similarities between civilizations that had no known contact with one another. The Egyptians built pyramids. So did the Maya, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. The ancient Indians spoke of a great flood, so did the Mesopotamians, so did the Greeks, so did the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands. Stone circles appeared in Britain, in Africa, in the Pacific. Serpent worship appeared in cultures separated by entire oceans. Flood myths, sun worship, creation stories involving a cosmic egg or a primordial ocean, these motifs appeared again and again, in culture after culture, continent after continent, with a regularity that seemed to defy coincidence. For many thinkers of the 19th century, the explanation was obvious. There must have been a common source. Somewhere in the deep past, there must have been a single original civilization, a mother culture, from which all others had descended. The similarities were not coincidences. They were memories, echoes, fragments of a once unified tradition that had been scattered across the world by some ancient catastrophe. This idea, the idea of a single lost source civilization, was not confined to the fringes. It was discussed seriously by educated men and women. It appeared in the pages of respected journals. It was debated in the salons of London and Paris. And it was given enormous impetus by a discovery that at the time seemed to provide the missing piece of the puzzle: the discovery of Atlantis, or rather the rediscovery of Atlantis, because Atlantis, of course, was not new. The story had been told by Plato in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BC. In those dialogues, Plato described a great island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis, Plato said, had been a powerful and advanced society, but it had grown arrogant and warlike, and the gods had punished it. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, Atlantis had sunk beneath the sea, vanishing forever. For more than 2,000 years, most scholars treated Plato's account as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, not a historical record. But in 1882, a man named Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and everything changed. Donnelly was a former congressman, a self-taught polymath, and a brilliantly persuasive writer. In his book, he argued that Plato's Atlantis was not a myth but a real place, a great continent in the Atlantic Ocean that had been the cradle of all civilization. Donnelly marshaled an impressive array of evidence: the similarities between Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids, the parallels between Old World and New World flood myths, the distribution of certain plant and animal species, and the geological evidence for catastrophic changes in the Earth's surface. He argued that Atlantis had been the original homeland from which colonists had spread to Egypt, to India, to Central and South America, carrying with them the seeds of civilization. Donnelly's book was a sensation. It sold enormously well. It was read by prime ministers and presidents. It spawned an entire genre of Atlantis literature that continues to this day. And more importantly, it established a template, a model, for how lost continent theories would work. The template went something like this. First, identify the mysterious similarities between ancient civilizations. Second, argue that these similarities cannot be explained by coincidence or independent invention. Third, propose a lost source civilization, a motherland that was the origin of all these shared features. Fourth, explain the disappearance of this civilization through a catastrophe, a flood, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption. Fifth, claim that the evidence for this lost civilization has been suppressed, misunderstood, or overlooked by mainstream scholars. It was a powerful template, and it was exactly this template that would be used a few decades later to construct the legend of Mu. But before we get to Mu itself, we need to understand another lost continent, one that, in a strange twist of intellectual history, began as a legitimate scientific hypothesis before being hijacked by mystics and visionaries and transformed into something its creator would never have recognized. That continent was Lemuria. Chapter 2, Lemuria, the Scientist's Lost Continent. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater published a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Science that would have consequences he could never have imagined. Sclater was puzzling over a genuine scientific mystery: the distribution of lemurs. Lemurs, those wide-eyed, long-tailed primates with their eerily human hands, are found primarily in Madagascar, the great island off the southeastern coast of Africa. But fossil evidence suggested that lemur-like creatures had once existed in India as well, and possibly in parts of Southeast Asia. How could this be? Madagascar and India are separated by thousands of miles of Indian Ocean. How had lemurs or their ancestors traveled between them? Sclater proposed a simple, elegant solution. He suggested that there had once been a land bridge, a now sunken landmass, connecting Madagascar to India across the Indian Ocean. He called this hypothetical landmass Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution it was meant to explain. At the time, this was a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. The theory of plate tectonics had not yet been developed. Continental drift was decades away from being proposed, let alone accepted. Scientists in the mid-19th century had no mechanism to explain how continents could move, and so the idea of land bridges, strips of land that had once connected now separated landmasses before sinking beneath the sea, was widely accepted as a way to explain the distribution of plants and animals across the globe. Sclater's Lemuria was a modest proposal. It was a land bridge, not a continent. It was meant to explain the distribution of primates, not the origins of civilization. And within the scientific community, it was discussed calmly, debated on its merits, and eventually abandoned, as the theory of plate tectonics provided a far better explanation for the biogeographical puzzles that Lemuria had been designed to solve. The reason lemurs are found in both Madagascar and India is not that there was once a land bridge between them, but that Madagascar, India, and Africa were once part of the same supercontinent, Gondwana, which broke apart over tens of millions of years through the process of continental drift. The lemurs did not cross an ocean. The ocean came to them, splitting the land they lived on into separate pieces that slowly drifted apart. But that is not where the story of Lemuria ends. Because before the scientists were finished with Lemuria, the mystics got hold of it. The most important of these mystics was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, one of the most influential esoteric movements of the 19th century. Blavatsky was a Russian-born occultist who claimed to be in contact with a group of spiritually advanced beings she called the Mahatmas or the Masters, who were said to dwell in hidden locations in Tibet and to possess knowledge of the true history of humanity, knowledge that had been preserved in secret for millennia. In her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, Blavatsky laid out an extraordinary alternative history of the human race. According to Blavatsky, humanity had not evolved through natural selection, as Darwin claimed. Instead, humanity had passed through a series of root races, each associated with a different continent and a different stage of spiritual development. The third root race, according to Blavatsky, had lived on Lemuria. These Lemurians were gigantic beings, some of them hermaphroditic, some with a third eye that gave them psychic powers. They were not fully physical in the way modern humans are. They existed in a more ethereal state, partway between spirit and matter. Lemuria, in Blavatsky's telling, was not a modest land bridge in the Indian Ocean, but a vast continent that stretched across much of the southern hemisphere. And its destruction, caused by volcanic cataclysm, had paved the way for the next stage of human evolution, the fourth root race which had lived on Atlantis. Blavatsky's Lemuria had almost nothing in common with Sclater's. Sclater's Lemuria was a geological hypothesis, testable and falsifiable. Blavatsky's Lemuria was a spiritual narrative, immune to disproof because it was based not on physical evidence but on alleged psychic revelation. But Blavatsky's version was far more exciting, far more dramatic, and far more appealing to people who were hungry for a grand, cosmic narrative that gave meaning and purpose to human existence. And so it was Blavatsky's Lemuria, not Sclater's, that captured the popular imagination and refused to let go. This is a pattern we will see again and again in the story of Mu. A legitimate scientific concept, in this case, the idea of a sunken landmass in the Indian Ocean, is taken out of its original context, inflated beyond all recognition, and transformed into a vehicle for mystical, spiritual, or pseudo-historical claims. The scientific veneer gives the claim an air of respectability. The mystical content gives it emotional power, and the combination of the two proves almost irresistible. It was into this world, a world already populated by Atlantis and Lemuria, by lost continents and vanished civilizations, by mystical revelations and grand narratives of human decline, that the legend of Mu was born. And it was born, as so many legends are, from a mistake. Chapter 3, The Mistranslation That Launched a Continent. The story of Mu begins, paradoxically, not in the Pacific Ocean but in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, and not with James Churchward, but with a French priest and scholar named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg. Brasseur de Bourbourg was a fascinating figure, a Catholic abbé who devoted much of his life to the study of Mesoamerican civilizations. He learned indigenous languages, traveled extensively in Central America, and made a number of genuinely important contributions to the study of Maya culture. He was among the first Europeans to study the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, and he published editions and translations of several important colonial-era texts that might otherwise have been lost. But Brasseur de Bourbourg also had a fatal weakness. He was drawn to grand, speculative theories, and he was not always rigorous in distinguishing between what his sources actually said and what he wanted them to say. In the 1860s, Brasseur de Bourbourg turned his attention to the Maya script, the hieroglyphic writing system used by the ancient Maya, which had not yet been deciphered. He obtained a copy of a document known as the Trono Codex, one of the few surviving Maya manuscripts that had escaped the systematic destruction carried out by Spanish missionaries in the 16th century. And in attempting to read it, Brasseur de Bourbourg made a crucial decision. He decided to use a key, a supposed alphabet of Maya hieroglyphics that had been compiled by the 16th century Spanish bishop Diego de Landa. Landa's alphabet was one of the most misleading documents in the history of linguistics. When Landa had interrogated his Maya informants, asking them to provide the Maya equivalents of Spanish letters, the informants had done their best to comply, but the Maya writing system does not work like an alphabet. It is a mixed system of logograms and syllabic signs, far more complex than a simple one symbol per letter correspondence. The result was a key that was almost entirely useless for reading actual Maya texts. It would be more than a century before scholars like Yuri Norzov, Tatyana Proskuryakov, and others finally cracked the Maya code using entirely different methods. But Brasseur de Bourbourg did not know this. Using Landa's flawed alphabet, he attempted to read the Trono Codex, and he produced a translation that was, by any modern standard, completely wrong. What Brasseur de Bourbourg believed he had found was an account of a terrible volcanic catastrophe that had destroyed an ancient land. He identified two hieroglyphic signs that he interpreted as the letters M and U, and he concluded that the Trono Codex described the destruction of a land called Mu. He published his translation in 1869, claiming that the Maya had preserved the memory of a great cataclysm that had swallowed a continent in the ocean. It was a spectacular misreading. The Trono Codex, as later scholars would determine, contains no account of a sunken continent. It deals primarily with astronomical tables, divination, and ritual matters. The signs Brasseur de Bourbourg read as M and U do not spell Mu. His entire translation was, from beginning to end, a product of wishful thinking applied through a fundamentally broken decipherment system. But the damage was done. The word Mu was now in circulation. It had the authority of a French scholar behind it. It had the exotic allure of the Maya behind it. And it would soon find its way into the hands of a man who would take Brasseur de Bourbourg's mistake and build it into one of the most elaborate pseudo-historical fantasies of the 20th century. Before we meet that man, however, we should mention another figure who helped set the stage, Augustus Le Plongeon. Le Plongeon was a French-born photographer, archaeologist, and adventurer who spent years living and working in the Yucatan in the 1870s and 1880s. He was among the first to photograph many Maya ruins, and he carried out excavations at several important sites, including Chichen Itza, where he unearthed a reclining stone figure that he dubbed Chak Mul, a name that, though based on a mistranslation, has stuck to this day. Le Plongeon was a tireless worker and a genuinely courageous explorer. He and his wife, Alice Dixon Le Plongeon, endured extraordinary hardships in the jungles of the Yucatan, living among indigenous communities, contracting tropical diseases, and facing political instability and armed conflict. But Le Plongeon was also a man of extravagant imagination, and his interpretations of Maya inscriptions went far beyond anything the evidence could support. Building on Brasseur de Bourbourg's work, Le Plongeon claimed that the Maya civilization was not merely old, but was, in fact, the oldest civilization on Earth. He believed that the Maya had been the original architects of Egyptian civilization, that colonists from the Yucatan had sailed across the Atlantic to found Egypt, carrying with them the knowledge of pyramid building, hieroglyphic writing, and religious ritual. He even claimed to have translated Maya inscriptions that told the story of a queen named Mu, who, after a political catastrophe in the Yucatan, had fled to Egypt, where she was worshipped as the goddess Isis. Le Plongeon also embraced the idea of Mu. He identified Mu not as a Pacific continent, but as a land in the Atlantic, essentially merging the concepts of Mu and Atlantis, and he claimed that the Maya were the direct descendants of the people of Mu, preserving in their temples and inscriptions the memory of the lost motherland. Le Plongeon's theories were rejected by the academic establishment of his day, and he died in 1908 in relative obscurity, bitter and frustrated. His translations of Maya inscriptions were, like Brasseur de Bourbourg's, based on Landa's flawed alphabet and were entirely wrong. Modern Maya epigraphy has shown that the inscriptions Le Plongeon claimed to read do not say what he said they said, but Le Plongeon's ideas did not die with him. They lived on in the works of other writers, and they would reach their fullest, most elaborate, most fantastical expression in the writings of a man who had never excavated a ruin, never deciphered a script, and never conducted a single piece of original archaeological research, but who would, through sheer force of imagination and persuasive prose, convince millions of people that a lost continent had once existed in the Pacific Ocean. His name was James Churchward. Chapter 4, The Colonel and His Secret. Tablets. James Churchward was born in 1851 in Bridgnorth, Shropshire, England. The details of his early life are, like so much about Churchward, difficult to verify. He claimed to have served in the British military, reaching the rank of colonel, though researchers have been unable to confirm this claim in military records. He claimed to have traveled extensively in India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. He claimed to have studied ancient languages, to have been initiated into secret knowledge by Hindu priests, and to have spent years poring over manuscripts and tablets that contain the true history of mankind. What we do know for certain is that Churchward emigrated from England, eventually settling in the northeastern part of a large country in the Western Hemisphere, where he spent the last decades of his life writing and promoting his theories about Mu. Between 1926 and 1935, he published 5 books: The Lost Continent of Mu, The Children of Mu, The Sacred Symbols of Mu, Cosmic Forces of Mu, and the Second Book of Cosmic Forces of Mu. These books, written in a confident, authoritative, almost grandfatherly tone, laid out the most detailed account of the lost continent that had ever been produced. And it all began, Churchward said, with the tablets. According to Churchward's account, the pivotal event of his life occurred in India, sometime in the 1870s, when he was a young man serving in the British forces. He befriended a Hindu priest, a rishi Churchward called him, at a temple whose location Churchward never precisely identified. This rishi, recognizing something special in the young Englishman, agreed to show him a set of ancient clay tablets that had been hidden in the temple for thousands of years. These tablets, the rishi told him, were written in a language called Naacal, the original language of mankind, the tongue spoken by the priests and scholars of Mu before the continent's destruction. The tablets, according to Churchward, told the story of the creation of the world, the rise of the great civilization of Mu, and the catastrophe that destroyed it. They described the religion of Mu, its system of government, its scientific achievements, and the colonies it had established around the world. Churchward claimed that the rishi taught him to read Naacal, and that over a period of 2 years, the two men worked together to translate the tablets. The knowledge Churchward gained from these translations, he said, became the foundation of everything he would later write about Mu. There are several problems with this story, and they begin with the most obvious one. No one has ever seen these tablets. Churchward never produced them. He never allowed anyone else to examine them. He never photographed them. He never provided the name of the temple where they were kept, or the name of the rishi who showed them to him, or any other detail that would allow his claims to be independently verified. When challenged on this point, Churchward would say that the tablets were sacred objects, closely guarded by their priestly custodians, and that he had been sworn to secrecy about their location. This is, of course, a classic feature of pseudo-historical claims. The evidence is always just out of reach, always in the possession of someone who cannot or will not share it, always hidden behind a veil of secrecy or sacredness that conveniently prevents independent verification. But let us set aside, for the moment, the question of whether the Naacal tablets existed and simply listen to what Churchward said they told him. Because whatever else may be said about James Churchward, the man could tell a story. Chapter 5, The World According to Churchward, the glory of Mu. In Churchward's telling, Mu was not merely a continent, it was paradise. The continent itself, he said, stretched across the central Pacific Ocean, from roughly the Hawaiian Islands in the north to Easter Island in the southeast and the Mariana Islands in the west. It was a vast, flat, tropical landmass covered in lush vegetation, blessed with a mild and pleasant climate and surrounded by warm, bountiful seas. Rivers wound through its plains, forests of exotic trees covered its hillsides. It was, Churchward wrote, a beautiful tropical country, a garden of earthly delights, and it was old. According to Churchward, human civilization on Mu dated back at least 50,000 years and possibly much longer. This was, by the standards of mainstream archaeology, an absurdly early date. In the 1920s, when Churchward was writing, the oldest known civilizations, Sumer and Egypt, were dated to roughly 3000 BC, and even the most generous estimates of human cultural development did not push organized civilization back much further than 10 or 15,000 years. Churchward was claiming a history 10 times longer, without a shred of archaeological evidence to support it. But Churchward was undaunted. In his books, he painted a vivid, detailed, and extraordinarily confident picture of life on Mu. The people of Mu, Churchward said, belonged to a single race, a white race, he specified, in a detail that reveals much about the racial assumptions of his era. They were tall, handsome, and long-lived. They were organized into a sophisticated social hierarchy, with a priestly class at the top, a governing class below them, and a large population of farmers, artisans, and laborers beneath. At the summit of the social order was a figure Churchward called Ra-Mu, a priest-king who served as both the spiritual and temporal ruler of the continent. The civilization of Mu, according to Churchward, was technologically advanced, though the nature of that advancement was somewhat vaguely defined. Churchward did not claim that the Muans had electricity or automobiles or anything resembling modern technology. Instead, he suggested that they had mastered what he called cosmic forces, mysterious energies related to magnetism, gravity, and the fundamental structure of matter. These cosmic forces, Churchward implied, were the secret behind the Muans' ability to construct enormous buildings, to navigate the oceans, and to achieve feats of engineering that would seem miraculous even by modern standards. The religion of Mu was, in Churchward's account, a monotheistic worship of a single, supreme deity, a cosmic creative force that Churchward identified with the sun. The symbol of this religion was a circle with a dot in the center, representing the sun and, by extension, the divine creative principle. The priests of Mu, the Naacal Brotherhood, were the guardians of this religion, and they were also the custodians of all scientific and spiritual knowledge. They were in effect a combination of priests, scientists, and philosophers, a spiritual elite who had achieved a level of understanding that modern humanity can only dimly imagine. Churchward was very specific about the population of Mu. He claimed that the continent was home to 64 million people, a number that he stated with the casual precision of a census official, despite the fact that it was, like everything else in his account, completely unverifiable. He also claimed that the people of Mu had established colonies throughout the world. Muans had sailed east across the Pacific to settle the western coasts of distant continents. They had sailed west across the Indian Ocean to settle India and eventually Egypt. They had colonized the Pacific Islands, leaving behind the ancestors of the Polynesians. Every great civilization of antiquity, in Churchward's telling, was a colony or a descendant of Mu. This was the Mu that Churchward described, a golden age civilization, a paradise of wisdom and harmony, the Eden from which all of humanity's greatest achievements had originally sprung. It was in many ways a secular version of the Garden of Eden, a story of primordial perfection from which humanity had fallen not through sin but through geological catastrophe. And it was the catastrophe, of course, that gave the story its dramatic power. Chapter 6, The Destruction of Mu according to Churchward. The destruction of Mu was sudden, violent, and total. The continent, he explained, was supported from below by a series of vast underground gas chambers, enormous cavities in the Earth's crust filled with gases and subject to immense pressure. For thousands of years, these chambers had remained stable, supporting the weight of the continent above them. But eventually, Churchward was vague about the exact timing, suggesting it had occurred roughly 12,000 years ago. The chambers began to collapse. The collapse began with earthquakes. Massive tremors shook the continent, toppling buildings, cracking roads, and sending the people of Mu into a panic. The earthquakes were followed by volcanic eruptions as the collapsing gas chambers released their contents through fissures in the Earth's surface. Columns of fire and smoke rose into the sky. Lava flowed across the once peaceful landscape, the air filled with ash and poisonous gases. And then came the final, most terrifying phase of the cataclysm, the sinking. As the gas chambers emptied, the continent lost its support. Great sections of land began to drop, sliding downward into the voids beneath. The sea rushed in to fill the gaps. Enormous waves, tsunamis of unimaginable size, swept across the continent, drowning everything in their path. In a matter of hours, Churchward said, the entire continent of Mu slid beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean. Churchward described the scene in vivid, almost cinematic terms. He wrote of the terrified populace fleeing toward the coasts, only to be met by walls of water. He wrote of temples collapsing, of priests offering final prayers to the heavens, of the last moments of a civilization that had believed itself eternal. He wrote of the silence that followed the silence of an empty ocean where hours before a continent of 64 million souls had stood. It was powerful writing, it was affecting, and it was, as we shall see, geologically impossible. But the story did not end with the destruction. According to Churchward, some survivors escaped. Colonists who had already established settlements in distant lands continued their lives, carrying with them the knowledge and traditions of the motherland. It was these survivors, Churchward said, who founded the civilizations of Egypt, India, Burma, and the Pacific Islands. The myths and symbols of these civilizations, the flood stories, the sun worship, the pyramid building, were all memories of Mu, preserved through thousands of years of oral tradition and carved into stone by descendants who had never forgotten their lost homeland. The remnants of Mu itself, Churchward claimed, could still be seen in the scattered islands of the Pacific. The Hawaiian Islands, Easter Island, Fiji, Tonga, the Marquesas, the Caroline Islands, all of these, he said, were the mountain peaks and high plateaus of the sunken continent, the only parts of Mu that had remained above the waves after the cataclysm. The people who lived on these islands, the Polynesians, the Micronesians, the Melanesians, were the direct descendants of the citizens of Mu, living on the last visible fragments of their ancestors' once great homeland. Chapter 7, The Evidence, Churchward's Case for Mu. Churchward did not expect his readers to take his claims on faith alone. He knew that extraordinary claims required evidence, or at least the appearance of evidence, and he filled his books with what he presented as proof of Mu's existence. This evidence fell into several categories, and it is worth examining each of them, both to understand the appeal of Churchward's argument and to understand why that argument ultimately fails. The Naacal tablets, as we have already discussed, the foundation of Churchward's case was the set of ancient clay tablets he claimed to have been shown by a Hindu rishi in India. These tablets, written in the Naacal language, supposedly contain the history of Mu, its creation, its civilization, and its destruction. The problems with this evidence are obvious and have already been noted. No one other than Churchward ever saw these tablets. He never produced them for examination. He never provided photographs. He never identified the temple where they were kept or the rishi who showed them to him. The Naacal language in which they were supposedly written has never been identified by any linguist, and no examples of it exist outside of Churchward's own writings. In short, the Naacal tablets are an unfalsifiable claim. They cannot be verified, and their existence depends entirely on the word of one man, a man who, as we shall see, had a pattern of making claims that could not be independently confirmed. The William Niven tablets, in addition to the Naacal tablets, Churchward cited a set of stone tablets that he said had been discovered in Mexico by a mining engineer and amateur archaeologist named William Niven. In the 1920s, Niven claimed to have unearthed hundreds, possibly thousands, of small stone tablets carved with mysterious symbols in the Valley of Mexico. Niven, who was a real person and who did conduct excavations in Mexico, brought some of these tablets to Churchward's attention, and Churchward immediately declared that they were inscriptions from the lost continent of Mu, written in the Naacal language. Churchward published reproductions of many of these tablets in his books, accompanied by translations that he said confirmed the history he had learned from the Indian tablets. The symbols on Niven's tablets, Churchward said, were identical to the Naacal script, proving that the civilizations of Mexico and of Mu were connected. The reality, as subsequent investigators have shown, is more complicated and less romantic. Niven's tablets are real objects. They exist in museum collections and have been examined by archaeologists. But they are not evidence of a lost Pacific continent. Most scholars who have examined them believe they are pre-Columbian artifacts from the cultures of the Valley of Mexico, cultures that are well documented and have nothing to do with a sunken continent. The symbols on them are consistent with known Mesoamerican iconographic traditions. Churchward's translations of these tablets were not based on any recognized linguistic method and were, like Brasseur de Bourbourg's translations of the Trono Codex, products of imagination rather than scholarship. Moreover, there are serious questions about the provenance of many of Niven's tablets. Niven was known to have purchased tablets from local dealers as well as excavating them himself, and the antiquities market in early 20th century Mexico was rife with forgeries. It is possible, even likely, that some of the tablets Niven acquired were modern fabrications, produced to meet the demand of collectors. Architectural and symbolic parallels. One of Churchward's most rhetorically effective arguments was his claim that the same symbols and architectural forms appeared in cultures all over the world, proving that they all descended from a common source, Mu. He pointed to the prevalence of pyramid-like structures in Egypt, Mesoamerica, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. He noted the widespread use of sun symbols, serpent motifs, and geometric patterns in the art and architecture of diverse cultures. He identified what he called the sacred symbols of Mu, a set of geometric designs including circles, triangles, and specific patterns of lines and dots that he said appeared in inscriptions from India, Egypt, Mexico, and the Pacific, all traceable to the original religion of Mu. This argument sounds compelling at first, but it rests on several fallacies. First, it commits the fallacy of assuming that similarity implies connection. The fact that two cultures independently built pyramid-like structures does not prove that they were in contact with each other or that they descended from a common ancestor. Pyramids are, from an engineering standpoint, the simplest and most obvious way to build a large, stable structure. A pyramid is essentially a pile. It is what you get when you stack stones on top of each other and make each layer smaller than the one below it. The pyramid shape has been independently invented by cultures all over the world, not because they learned it from a common source, but because it is the natural solution to the problem of building something big and tall with heavy materials. The same is true of sun symbols, serpent motifs, and geometric patterns. The sun is the most prominent object in the sky, visible to every culture on Earth, and it is not surprising that many cultures independently developed religious traditions centered on the sun. Serpents are found on every inhabited continent and are among the most striking and psychologically powerful animals in the natural world. It would be more surprising if they did not appear in the mythology of diverse cultures. And geometric patterns, circles, triangles, spirals, cross-hatching, are the basic vocabulary of visual design, available to any human being with a stick and a patch of mud or sand. Second, Churchward's argument is highly selective. He highlighted the similarities between cultures while ignoring the far more numerous differences. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mesoamerica, for example, differ enormously in their construction techniques, their purposes, their dates, and their cultural contexts. Egyptian pyramids are primarily tombs. Mesoamerican pyramids are primarily temple platforms. The similarities are superficial, the differences are profound. Third, Churchward's identification of sacred symbols of Mu was based on a highly subjective process of pattern recognition. He would look at an inscription or a carving, identify a shape that resembled one of his predetermined symbols, and declare it to be a Mu symbol, regardless of what the inscription actually said or what its creators intended it to mean. This is a classic example of apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or unrelated data. Given enough symbols and enough inscriptions, it is possible to find matches between almost anything. Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui, held a special place in Churchward's argument. This tiny, remote island in the southeastern Pacific is famous for its moai, the enormous stone statues that stand on platforms around the island's coast, staring inland with their massive, enigmatic faces. Churchward claimed that Easter Island was one of the last remaining fragments of Mu, a mountain peak that had remained above the waves when the rest of the continent sank. The moai, he said, were the work of the civilization of Mu or its immediate descendants, evidence of the advanced engineering capabilities that the Muans had possessed. The mysterious script found on Easter Island, Rongorongo, a system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets, was, Churchward said, a form of the Naacal language, further proof of the island's connection to Mu. Easter Island was and remains a powerful piece of the Mu mythos precisely because it is so genuinely mysterious. How did a small, isolated island with limited resources and a relatively small population produce hundreds of enormous stone statues, some weighing many tens of tons? How did the islanders transport these statues from the quarry where they were carved to the coastal platforms where they were erected? And what does the Rongorongo script say? These are real questions and they are fascinating, but the answer to them is not Mu. Decades of archaeological research on Easter Island have shown that the moai were carved and transported by the Polynesian inhabitants of the island, using techniques that, while impressive, are entirely within the capabilities of a determined and well-organized human community. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the statues could have been moved using wooden sledges, log rollers, or even a walking technique in which the statues were rocked from side to side and gradually inched forward. The Rongorongo script, while still undeciphered, shows no resemblance to any known writing system, let alone to a hypothetical Naacal language. And the island itself is a volcanic formation, the product of volcanic activity on the Pacific seafloor, not the remnant of a sunken continent. Polynesian oral traditions. Churchward also drew on Polynesian oral traditions to support his claims. He noted that many Polynesian cultures have legends of a great homeland, a place of origin from which their ancestors had sailed to reach their current island homes. The Maori of New Zealand, for example, speak of Hawaii, a mythical homeland to the west. Other Polynesian groups have similar traditions. Churchward interpreted these traditions as memories of Mu, as evidence that the Polynesian peoples knew, on some deep cultural level, that their ancestors had come from a now sunken continent. This is, once again, a misinterpretation based on a superficial reading of cultural material. Polynesian oral traditions do indeed speak of ancestral homelands, but these homelands can be identified with real places within the Polynesian migration network. The Maori tradition of Hawaii, for example, likely refers to one or more islands in central Polynesia, possibly in the Society Islands or the Cook Islands, from which the ancestors of the Maori set out on their voyages to New Zealand. These traditions are records of real migrations across real oceans, not memories of a sunken continent. The actual history of Polynesian migration is, in many ways, more remarkable than the legend of Mu. Over a period of roughly 2,000 years, Polynesian navigators, using only canoes, sails, and their extraordinary knowledge of stars, currents, and ocean swells, colonized an area of the Pacific Ocean larger than any continent, reaching from New Zealand in the southwest to Hawaii in the north to Easter Island in the southeast. They did this without writing, without metal tools, and without any of the cosmic forces that Churchward attributed to the people of Mu. They did it through skill, courage, knowledge, and an intimacy with the ocean that is one of the most remarkable achievements in all of human history. To attribute their accomplishments to a lost continent is not just wrong, It is an insult to the genuine genius of Polynesian civilization. Chapter 8: The Geological Impossibility of All the Arguments Against Mu. The most devastating is the simplest. There is no evidence, and there could be no evidence, that a continent ever existed in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This is not a matter of debate or interpretation. It is a matter of geology. The theory of plate tectonics, developed in the mid-20th century and now universally accepted by geologists, provides a detailed and well-tested explanation for the structure of the Earth's surface. The Earth's outer layer, the lithosphere, is divided into a number of large plates that float on the semi-fluid asthenosphere beneath. These plates move slowly but continuously, driven by convection currents in the Earth's mantle, and their movements create the major geological features of the planet: mountains, ocean basins, earthquake zones, and volcanic arcs. The continents are composed of a specific type of rock, continental crust, that is relatively thick, relatively light, and relatively old. The ocean floors, by contrast, are composed of oceanic crust, which is thinner, denser, and younger. Continental crust and oceanic crust are fundamentally different in their composition, their thickness, and their geological history. The floor of the Pacific Ocean is composed entirely of oceanic crust. There is no continental crust in the Pacific Basin. This means that there is no geological foundation on which a continent could have existed. A continent cannot simply sink into the ocean because continental crust is less dense than oceanic crust and therefore floats on top of it like a block of wood floating on water. You cannot make a continent sink any more than you can make a wooden block sink in a bathtub by pushing it down. It always pops back up. Churchward's explanation for the sinking of Mu, that the continent was supported by underground gas chambers that collapsed, is not a real geological mechanism. There are no such gas chambers beneath the ocean floor. The idea is a fantasy, unsupported by any geological evidence or theory. Furthermore, the Pacific Ocean floor has been extensively mapped using sonar, satellite altimetry, and deep-sea drilling. If a continent had existed in the Pacific within the last 12,000 years, or even within the last 12 million years, its remnants would be clearly visible on the ocean floor. There would be vast areas of continental crust, quite different in composition from the surrounding oceanic crust. There would be sedimentary deposits consistent with a continental environment, river deposits, lake beds, terrestrial fossils. There would be the remains of mountains, valleys, and plains, all composed of the kinds of rocks found on continents. None of this exists. The floor of the Pacific Ocean is composed of basaltic oceanic crust, produced at mid-ocean ridges by volcanic activity, exactly as plate tectonic theory predicts. There is no trace of a sunken continent. There is no Mu. The islands of the Pacific, the very islands that Churchward claimed were the remnants of Mu, are volcanic in origin. They were produced by volcanic activity on the ocean floor, not by the fragmentation of a sinking continent. The Hawaiian Islands, for example, were formed by a volcanic hotspot, a plume of magma rising from deep in the Earth's mantle that has been creating islands as the Pacific plate moves slowly over it. Each Hawaiian island was formed at the hotspot and then carried away by plate motion, creating a chain of islands that stretches across the Pacific. Easter Island, similarly, is a volcanic island formed by volcanic eruptions on the East Pacific Rise. These islands were never part of a continent. They rose from the sea floor through volcanic activity, and they will eventually sink back beneath the waves as erosion and subsidence take their toll, but they will sink as islands, not as fragments of a continent. This is the rock, no pun intended, on which the legend of Mu founders. Whatever stories may be told, whatever tablets may be cited, whatever symbols may be compared, the geological evidence is clear and unanswerable. There was never a continent in the Pacific Ocean. Mu did not exist. Chapter 9: The World Churchward Inhabited. To understand why Churchward's claims were taken seriously by so many people, we need to understand the intellectual and cultural world in which he operated. The 1920s and 1930s, when Churchward published his books, were a period of enormous cultural ferment. The First World War had shattered the confidence of Western civilization. Millions had died in a conflict of unprecedented brutality, and the old certainties, the certainties of progress, of reason, of the inevitable advance of civilization, lay in ruins on the battlefields of France and Belgium. In the aftermath of the war, many people turned to alternative sources of meaning. Spiritualism flourished. Theosophy continued to attract followers. New religious movements sprang up. There was a widespread hunger for a narrative that could explain the state of the world, a narrative bigger, more encompassing, and more spiritually satisfying than anything offered by conventional science or conventional religion. Churchward's story of Mu provided exactly this. It offered a vision of a golden age, a time when humanity had been unified, peaceful, spiritually advanced, and living in harmony with the cosmos. It explained the current state of the world, its divisions, its conflicts, its spiritual emptiness, as the result of a fall from grace, a catastrophe that had destroyed the original paradise and scattered its survivors across a broken world. And it offered hope, the hope that by recovering the knowledge of Mu, by rediscovering the cosmic forces and spiritual truths that the Muans had mastered, humanity might reclaim its lost greatness. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of pseudoscience and alternative history. The lost golden age, the catastrophic fall, the hope of recovery, these are the elements of a myth, and they exert a powerful pull on the human psyche. They speak to our deepest fears and deepest longings, the fear that something has gone terribly wrong with the world, and the longing for a time when things were right. Churchward also benefited from the fact that in the 1920s, many of the scientific disciplines that would eventually demolish his claims were still in their infancy. Plate tectonics had not yet been developed. The theory of continental drift, proposed by Alfred Wegener in 1912, was still controversial and far from universally accepted. Radiocarbon dating had not yet been invented. The ages of archaeological sites and artifacts were often poorly established. The Maya script had not yet been deciphered. The claims of Brasseur de Bourbourg and Le Plongeon had not yet been definitively refuted. The deep history of Polynesian migration had not yet been worked out through archaeological excavation and linguistic analysis. In this environment of scientific uncertainty, Churchward's claims could not be definitively disproved, not because they were true, but because the tools needed to disprove them did not yet exist. And Churchward was skilled at exploiting this uncertainty. He peppered his books with references to geology, archaeology, linguistics, and comparative mythology, giving the impression of a man who had mastered all these fields. In reality, his understanding of these disciplines was superficial at best and grossly distorted at worst, but to a lay reader in the 1920s, his confident tone and his liberal use of technical-sounding language could be very persuasive. Churchward was also helped by the racial assumptions of his era. His claim that the people of Mu were a white race who had founded the civilizations of Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica fit neatly into the prevailing colonial ideology, which held that non-European civilizations could not have developed their achievements independently, but must have received them from a higher source. The idea that the pyramids of Egypt were built by Egyptians, or that the temples of the Maya were designed by Maya architects, was uncomfortable for many Europeans and their descendants, because it implied a level of intellectual and creative capability in non-European peoples that conflicted with the assumptions of racial hierarchy. Churchward's Mu provided a convenient alternative. The great civilizations of the non-European world were not the independent achievements of their builders, they were hand-me-downs from a lost white civilization. The brown-skinned peoples of the Pacific, the dark-skinned peoples of India, the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, all of them in Churchward's telling, owed their cultural accomplishments to the white colonists of Mu. This is one of the ugliest aspects of the Mu legend, and it is important to name it clearly. The idea of a lost white civilization as the source of all human culture is not merely wrong, it is racist. It denies the agency and creativity of non-European peoples. It reduces the magnificent achievements of diverse civilizations to mere copies of a mythical original, and it serves, whether intentionally or not, to reinforce the ideological foundations of colonialism and white supremacy. It is worth noting that this same racial dynamic appears in many other lost continent and lost civilization theories, including some versions of the Atlantis myth. The idea that primitive peoples could not have built their own monuments, written their own scripts, or developed their own religions without help from a superior, outside source is a persistent and pernicious one, and it continues to appear in popular culture to this day, in television shows about ancient aliens, in books about forbidden archaeology, and in countless websites and YouTube videos that ask with wide-eyed incredulity, how could they have built this? The answer in almost every case is simple. They built it because they were brilliant, resourceful, and determined. They did not need aliens, and they did not need Mu. Chapter 10. The reception of Churchward's Books. Churchward's books were not bestsellers on the scale of Donnelly's Atlantis, but they found a substantial and enthusiastic audience. The Lost Continent of Mu, first published in 1926, went through multiple printings and was translated into several languages. Churchward became a minor celebrity, giving lectures and interviews in which he promoted his theories with unfailing confidence and charm. The academic world, however, was not impressed. Geologists, archaeologists, linguists, and anthropologists who reviewed Churchward's work found it riddled with errors, unsupported claims, and fundamental misunderstandings of the disciplines he cited. His geological arguments were nonsensical. His linguistic claims were unfounded. His archaeological evidence was misinterpreted or fabricated. His comparative mythology was superficial and selective. One of the most damning critiques came from the field of geology. Even before the theory of plate tectonics was fully developed, geologists knew enough about the structure of the ocean floor to say with confidence that no continent had ever existed in the middle of the Pacific. Oceanographic surveys, seismological data, and the study of volcanic islands all pointed to the same conclusion. The Pacific Ocean basin was and always had been an oceanic basin, not the site of a sunken continent. Linguists were equally dismissive. The Naacal language that Churchward claimed to have learned from the Indian rishi bore no resemblance to any known language family. Churchward's translations of symbols and inscriptions were not based on any recognized method of decipherment. He would look at a symbol, decide what it meant based on his preconceived theory, and then declare his interpretation to be a translation. This is not how linguistics works. A genuine decipherment requires a systematic approach, the identification of recurring patterns, the testing of hypotheses against multiple texts, and the independent verification of results by other scholars. Churchward did none of this. Archaeologists pointed out that the similarities Churchward cited between different ancient civilizations were either superficial, coincidental, or the result of normal human psychological and architectural tendencies rather than evidence of a common source. The existence of pyramids in both Egypt and Mesoamerica, for example, does not prove a connection between them. It proves only that the pyramid shape is an obvious solution to the problem of building a large, stable structure with stone blocks. Despite these criticisms, Churchward's books continued to sell, and his ideas continued to circulate in popular culture. This is a phenomenon that is familiar to anyone who studies pseudoscience. Once a compelling narrative is established, it develops a life of its own, independent of the evidence for or against it. The story of Mu was too good, too satisfying, too emotionally resonant to be killed by mere facts. People wanted to believe in Mu, and so they did. Churchward died in 1936 at the age of 85, still convinced that he was right and that the academic establishment was wrong. He never wavered in his claims, never admitted error, never provided the evidence that his critics demanded. He went to his grave insisting that the Naacal tablets were real, that Mu had existed, and that the truth would eventually be recognized. Chapter 11, The Deeper Roots, Why We Want to Believe the Story of Mu as Told by James Churchward, is a product of the early 20th century. But the impulse behind it, the desire to believe in a lost golden age, a mother civilization, a paradise destroyed, is as old as human culture itself. Every society in every era has told stories about a time when things were better. The Greeks had their age of gold when humans lived without toil or sorrow under the reign of Kronos. The Hindus have their Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when Dharma reigns supreme and human life spans stretched to thousands of years. The Norse had their primordial world of Ginnungagap, from which the gods shaped a cosmos that would eventually be destroyed in the fires of Ragnarök. The Hebrew Bible opens with the Garden of Eden, a paradise from which humanity was expelled for the sin of seeking forbidden knowledge. These are myths, stories that a culture tells to explain its own origins, its own values, and its own relationship to the cosmos. They are not intended to be read as literal history. They are symbolic narratives, rich with meaning and psychological depth, that speak to the universal human experiences of loss, longing, and hope. The story of Mu is, at its heart, a modern myth of this kind. It uses the language and trappings of science, geology, archaeology, linguistics, but its structure is mythological. It tells the story of a paradise created, a paradise lost, and a paradise that might, through the recovery of ancient knowledge, be regained. It satisfies the same psychological needs that traditional myths satisfy: the need for a coherent origin story, the need to believe that the chaos of the present is not the natural state of things, and the need to hope for a better future rooted in a glorious past. This is why the story of Mu has proven so resistant to debunking. You cannot debunk a myth by pointing out that it is not literally true, because the power of a myth does not lie in its literal truth. It lies in its emotional and psychological resonance, and the story of Mu resonates with something very deep in the human psyche, the conviction that we have lost something precious, that the world was once better than it is now, and that somewhere, somehow, the key to restoring what was lost is waiting to be found. This does not mean that we should accept the story of Mu as true. The distinction between myth and history matters. Myths can illuminate the human condition, they can teach us about ourselves, they can inspire us and console us. But they are not evidence of historical events. To treat them as such is to confuse two fundamentally different kinds of truth, and that confusion has consequences, not just for our understanding of the past, but for our ability to think clearly and critically about the present. Chapter 12, Lemuria Revisited, the Theosophical thread. We have already touched on the connection between Lemuria and Mu, but it is worth exploring this connection in greater depth, because it reveals how ideas flow between different streams of alternative thought, merging and mingling and reinforcing each other until they form a single, powerful current of belief. Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy, as we noted, had adopted Sclater's Lemuria and transformed it from a geological hypothesis into a spiritual narrative. In Blavatsky's system, Lemuria was the home of the third root race, the continent on which humanity had passed through a crucial stage of its spiritual evolution. After Blavatsky's death in 1891, her followers continued to develop and elaborate the theosophical account of human history. Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbeater, two of the most prominent second-generation theosophists, claim to have used clairvoyant powers to investigate the deep past, and they produced detailed descriptions of life on Lemuria and Atlantis that went far beyond anything Blavatsky had written. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Anthroposophy, a movement that grew out of Theosophy, developed his own account of Lemuria, describing it as a continent of soft, malleable matter where human bodies were not yet fully solidified, and where reproduction occurred through a process of spiritual emanation rather than physical procreation. William Scott Elliott, a theosophist who published The Story of Atlantis in 1896 and The Lost Lemuria in 1904, provided maps of both continents, showing their changing shapes over millions of years as they gradually sank beneath the waves. These maps, based entirely on claimed clairvoyant investigation, were presented with the same matter-of-fact confidence as a geological survey. Into this rich stew of esoteric speculation, James Churchward added his own ingredient, Mu. Churchward was not a theosophist. He did not use the language of root races or spiritual evolution, and he distanced himself from the more overtly mystical elements of Theosophy. But his Mu occupied the same imaginative space as Blavatsky's Lemuria. Both were lost continents in the Pacific or Indian Ocean. Both were the homeland of an advanced ancient civilization. Both had been destroyed by geological catastrophe, and both served as the origin point for all subsequent human culture. The result was a kind of convergence. In the popular imagination, Mu and Lemuria became blurred, merged, almost interchangeable. People who believed in one tended to believe in the other. Books about Mu cited theosophical sources, and theosophical writers incorporated Churchward's ideas into their own narratives. The two traditions fed each other, creating a self-reinforcing loop of belief that was all the more resistant to criticism because it drew on multiple, apparently independent sources. This is a common feature of pseudohistorical and pseudoscientific belief systems. Individual claims may be weak, but when they are combined, they create an illusion of strength. Look, the believer says, Churchward's tablets confirm what Blavatsky learned from the Mahatmas, which confirms what Le Plongeon found in the Yucatan, which confirms what the Polynesians remember in their oral traditions. Each piece of evidence seems to support the others, creating a web of mutual reinforcement. But the web is an illusion because all of the individual pieces are flawed. A chain of weak links is not stronger than its weakest link, it is weaker. Chapter 13, The Real Pacific, a history more remarkable than Mu. One of the great ironies of the Mu legend is that the real history of the Pacific Ocean and its peoples is far more extraordinary, far more inspiring, and far more worthy of wonder than anything James Churchward ever imagined. The Pacific Ocean is the largest and deepest ocean on Earth. It covers more than 60 million square miles, more than all of the Earth's land area combined. It is home to more than 25,000 islands, ranging from the vast landmasses of New Guinea and New Zealand to tiny coral atolls barely visible above the waves. And it was colonized over a period of roughly 3,000 years by the most accomplished navigators in human history, the Polynesians. The story of Polynesian expansion across the Pacific is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire human story. Beginning from a homeland in Southeast Asia, the ancestors of the Polynesians, a people archaeologists call the Lapita, identified by their distinctive pottery, began moving eastward into the Pacific around 1500 BC. Over the next millennium, they colonized Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and then, after a pause of several centuries, they launched the most extraordinary phase of their expansion. From Samoa and Tonga, Polynesian voyagers sailed east into the vast, empty heart of the Pacific. They reached the Marquesas Islands around 300 AD, the Society Islands around 800 AD, Hawaii around 1000 AD, and New Zealand, the last major landmass to be colonized by humans, around 1250 to 1300 AD. Easter Island, the most remote inhabited island on Earth, was reached around 1200 AD. These voyages were not accidental. They were not the result of fishermen being blown off course and washing up on distant shores by luck. They were deliberate acts of exploration and colonization, planned and executed with extraordinary skill and courage. Polynesian navigators used a sophisticated system of wayfinding that drew on their knowledge of the stars, the sun, ocean swells, wind patterns, cloud formations, the behavior of birds, and the color of the water. They could read the ocean like a map, detecting subtle signs, a change in wave pattern, a particular cloud formation, the flight path of a bird that told them where land lay beyond the horizon. They traveled in large, double-hulled sailing canoes capable of carrying dozens of people, along with the plants, animals, and supplies needed to establish a new colony on a distant island. The precision of Polynesian navigation is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. These navigators could hold a course across thousands of miles of open ocean, with no compass, no charts, no instruments of any kind, and arrive at a tiny island, a speck of land in the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific, with pinpoint accuracy. They did this using knowledge passed down orally from generation to generation, accumulated and refined over centuries of practical experience. This is the real story of the Pacific. Not a lost continent, not a sunken paradise, not a mythical white civilization whose survivors seeded the world with culture. The real story is of brown-skinned men and women in wooden canoes, navigating by the stars, trusting their knowledge and their courage, crossing the greatest ocean on Earth and making it their home. To replace this story with the fantasy of Mu is not just an error, it is a loss. It is the substitution of a shallow, invented narrative for a deep, true one. It replaces the real achievements of real people with the imaginary achievements of imaginary people, and in doing so, it diminishes rather than enriches our understanding of the past. Chapter 14. The Psychology of Lost Continents. Why do people believe in lost continents? This is a question worth asking, not because we want to mock or belittle those who hold such beliefs, but because understanding the psychological roots of these beliefs can help us understand something important about ourselves. Psychologists who study belief in pseudoscience and conspiracy theories have identified several factors that make people susceptible to such beliefs. The first is pattern recognition. The human brain is a pattern-detecting machine. It evolved to find patterns in the environment, to recognize faces, to detect predators, to notice regularities in the behavior of prey animals and the growth of plants. This ability is one of our greatest strengths, but it has a weakness. It is too sensitive. It finds patterns even where none exist. When we look at the clouds, we see faces. When we look at random data, we see trends. When we look at the symbols and architectures of diverse civilizations, we see connections, and once we see them, it is very difficult to unsee them, even when we are told that the connections are illusory. The second factor is narrative thinking. Humans are storytelling animals. We understand the world through stories. We organize our experiences, our memories, and our expectations into narratives, sequences of events with beginnings, middles, and ends, with heroes and villains, with crises and resolutions. This tendency serves us well in many contexts, but it can also mislead us. When we encounter a set of facts that do not seem to fit together, we instinctively try to construct a story that makes sense of them. The story of Mu is, at its core, a narrative, a story that takes a set of puzzling observations, the similarities between ancient civilizations, the mysterious statues of Easter Island, the flood myths of diverse cultures, and weaves them into a single, coherent, emotionally satisfying tale. The fact that the story is not true does not diminish its narrative power. The third factor is what psychologists call the appeal to mystery. There's a deep human pleasure in encountering the unknown, the unexplained, the mysterious. We love mysteries. We love the feeling of standing at the edge of the known and peering into the darkness beyond. Lost continent theories exploit this pleasure by presenting the past as a vast, dark territory filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. The mainstream scientific account of the past, for all its genuine wonders, can sometimes seem dry, technical, and unromantic. The lost continent narrative, by contrast, is drenched in romance and mystery. It promises secret knowledge, hidden truths, and vast, ancient civilizations lurking just beyond the reach of conventional scholarship. The fourth factor is distrust of authority. Many people who believe in lost continents and similar alternative narratives are motivated, at least in part, by a distrust of established institutions, universities, governments, scientific organizations. They feel that these institutions are closed-minded, elitist, and unwilling to consider evidence that challenges their established narratives. This distrust is not entirely unfounded. The history of science contains many examples of new ideas being initially rejected by the establishment before eventually being accepted. But the conclusion that many alternative history believers draw, that any idea rejected by the establishment must therefore be true, is a logical fallacy. The fact that some rejected ideas turn out to be correct does not mean that all rejected ideas are correct. The fifth and perhaps most important factor is the emotional need for meaning. We live in a world that can feel random, chaotic, and meaningless. The great challenge of human existence is to find meaning in the face of this apparent meaninglessness. Lost continent theories offer a powerful form of meaning. They suggest that there is a hidden order to history, a grand narrative connecting the past to the present, a purpose and a pattern that mainstream accounts fail to see. For people who feel adrift in a confusing and rapidly changing world, this offer of hidden meaning can be almost irresistible. Understanding these psychological factors does not mean dismissing the people who hold these beliefs. It means recognizing that these beliefs are not random or irrational. They are the product of normal human cognitive processes operating on incomplete or misleading information. The believer in Mu is not stupid. The believer in Mu is human, and the same cognitive tendencies that lead some people to believe in Mu lead all of us in different contexts to make errors of judgment, to see patterns where none exist, and to prefer satisfying stories to unsatisfying truths. Chapter 15, Churchward's Legacy, the Afterlife of Mu. James Churchward died in 1936, but Mu did not die with him. The lost continent has continued to haunt the margins of popular culture for nearly a century, appearing in books, films, television shows, video games, and websites. It has been adopted by New Age movements, by alternative historians, by science fiction writers, and by conspiracy theorists. It has been merged with Lemuria, with Atlantis, with ancient alien theories, and with a bewildering variety of other alternative narratives about the deep past. In Japan, the legend of Mu has been particularly popular. The Japanese writer Kimura Masaki and others have argued that a submerged rock formation near the island of Yonaguni, off the coast of Okinawa, is evidence of a lost civilization, possibly Mu. The Yonaguni monument, as it is known, consists of a series of flat, step-like terraces cut into a submerged rock formation. Some researchers believe these terraces are natural geological formations, shaped by erosion and tectonic activity. Others insist that they are artificial, the work of human hands, and possibly the ruins of a Mu-related civilization. The debate over the Yonaguni monument is ongoing, and it is a legitimate scientific question, though the weight of geological evidence currently favors a natural origin. But the ease with which the Yonaguni monument has been incorporated into the Mu narrative illustrates a key feature of pseudo-historical thinking. Any unexplained or ambiguous piece of evidence is immediately seized upon as confirmation of the pre-existing theory, regardless of whether it actually supports that theory or not. In the New Age community, Mu, often blurred with Lemuria, has become a symbol of ancient spiritual wisdom. Books with titles like Memories of Lemuria and the Lemurian Way promise to reveal the spiritual teachings of the lost continent, channeled through psychic contact with the spirits of its long-dead inhabitants. These books describe the Lemurians or Muans as beings of pure love and light, deeply attuned to the vibrations of the cosmos, living in harmony with nature and with each other. They are, in effect, projections of contemporary New Age values onto an imaginary past, a way of claiming ancient authority for modern spiritual preferences. The internet has given the legend of Mu a new lease on life. Websites, forums, and social media groups devoted to Mu and Lemuria proliferate, sharing theories, images, and alleged evidence with a global audience. In the age of the internet, the barriers to entry for pseudo-historical claims have been dramatically lowered. Anyone with a computer and an internet connection can publish a theory about Mu, and that theory can reach thousands or millions of people without ever being subjected to peer review, fact-checking, or critical scrutiny. This is one of the great challenges of our era. The democratization of information has brought enormous benefits, but it has also made it easier than ever for false and misleading claims to spread. The legend of Mu, which might have faded into obscurity in the age of print, has found new life in the age of digital communication. Chapter 16, The Comparative Method, How Real Scholars Study Cultural Similarities. One of the most important lessons we can learn from the story of Mu is the difference between how pseudo-historians and how real scholars approach the problem of cultural similarities. As we have seen, Churchward and his predecessors pointed to similarities between ancient civilizations, pyramids, sun worship, flood myths, serpent motifs, and concluded that these similarities could only be explained by a common source, a lost mother civilization from which all others descended. Real scholars, however, approach these similarities with much greater caution and methodological rigor. They recognize that cultural similarities between unrelated societies can be explained in several ways, and they do not jump to the most dramatic explanation without first eliminating the simpler ones. The first and simplest explanation is independent invention. Human beings everywhere face similar challenges: the challenge of building large structures, the challenge of explaining natural phenomena, the challenge of organizing society, the challenge of confronting death. It is not surprising that different societies, facing these same challenges, sometimes arrive at similar solutions. Pyramids, as we have noted, are a natural shape for a large stone structure. Flood myths are a natural response to the experience of flooding, which occurs in river valleys and coastal areas all over the world. Sun worship is a natural response to the overwhelming importance of the sun in human life. These similarities do not require a common source; they require only the common humanity of the people who produced them. The second explanation is diffusion, the spread of ideas and technologies from one culture to another through trade, migration, or conquest. Diffusion is a real and well-documented phenomenon. Ideas and technologies do spread between cultures, sometimes across great distances. But diffusion requires evidence, evidence of contact, evidence of trade routes, evidence of migration paths. It cannot simply be assumed on the basis of superficial similarities. The third explanation is coincidence. In a world with thousands of cultures, each producing millions of artifacts, symbols, and stories over thousands of years, some similarities are bound to occur by chance alone. The law of large numbers guarantees it. Finding two cultures that both used a particular geometric symbol, or both told a particular type of story, is not remarkable; it is statistically inevitable. Real scholars weigh these explanations carefully, looking at the full context of the similarities they observe. They ask, how deep are the similarities? Are they structural or superficial? Do they extend to details or only to general outline? Is there independent evidence of contact between the cultures in question? Do the similar elements serve the same function in both cultures, or do they serve different functions? Are there also significant differences between the cultures, and if so, do these differences outweigh the similarities? This kind of careful, contextual analysis is the antithesis of the pseudo-historical method, which seizes on superficial similarities, ignores differences, and leaps to the most dramatic possible conclusion. The comparative method, properly applied, is a powerful tool for understanding the human past, but it must be applied with discipline, humility, and a willingness to accept conclusions that are less exciting but more true. Chapter 17, The Flood Myths, a case study. The prevalence of flood myths in cultures around the world has been one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for lost continents and ancient cataclysms. Churchward cited flood myths as evidence that the destruction of Mu was remembered in the oral traditions of diverse peoples. Donnelly did the same for Atlantis, and countless other writers have pointed to the ubiquity of flood stories as proof that some great deluge actually occurred in the distant past. It is worth looking at this claim in some detail, because it illustrates both the appeal and the weakness of the lost continent argument. It is true that flood myths are remarkably widespread. The Hebrew Bible tells the story of Noah and the Great Flood. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh contains a very similar story, in which the hero Utnapishtim survives a divine flood by building a great boat. The Greeks told the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. Hindu tradition describes a great flood from which Manu was saved by a miraculous fish. Chinese mythology tells of a great flood that the hero Yu tamed through years of labor. Indigenous cultures in the Pacific, in South Asia, in Africa, and in the Western Hemisphere all have flood traditions of various kinds. The lost continent theorist looks at this evidence and says, there are flood myths everywhere, therefore there must have been a real global flood, therefore a continent must have sunk. but this reasoning is flawed at every step. First, while flood myths are widespread, they are not universal. Not every culture has a flood myth, and those that do tell very different stories. The details of the myths, the cause of the flood, the identity of the survivors, the means of survival, the aftermath, vary enormously from culture to culture. The similarities are at the level of general theme: a great flood destroys the world, not at the level of specific detail. This pattern is consistent with independent invention, not with a common source. Second, the prevalence of flood myths is easily explained without recourse to a global catastrophe or a sunken continent. Floods are among the most common and most destructive natural disasters. Virtually every human society has experienced flooding at some point in its history. River valleys, where the earliest civilizations arose, are particularly prone to flooding. It would be astonishing if cultures that regularly experienced devastating floods did not develop stories about floods. Third, the geological and archaeological evidence decisively rules out a global flood of the kind described in these myths. There is no geological evidence for a worldwide flood at any point during the last several 100,000 years. Sea levels have risen and fallen over time, sometimes dramatically, but these changes occurred gradually over thousands of years, not in a single catastrophic event. The flood myths are real, and they are fascinating. They tell us important things about the fears, the experiences, and the imaginations of the cultures that produced them. But they do not tell us about a sunken continent. They tell us about floods, which are real, and about the human tendency to mythologize real experiences, which is also real. Chapter 18, The Damage Done. It would be easy to dismiss the legend of Mu as a harmless curiosity, a colorful footnote in the history of ideas, a charming piece of early 20th century pseudoscience that has long since been overtaken by real knowledge. And in some ways it is harmless. No one has been hurt by believing in Mu. No wars have been fought over it. No governments have been overthrown. But the legend of Mu is not entirely harmless either. It has caused damage, subtle damage perhaps, but damage nonetheless in several ways. First, it has distorted popular understanding of the real history of the Pacific and its peoples. By attributing the achievements of Pacific island cultures to a mythical lost continent, the Mu narrative denies these cultures their rightful place in history. The Polynesians were not the scattered remnants of a sunken civilization. They were the creators of one of the most remarkable cultures in human history, a culture that mastered the art of ocean navigation, colonized the largest ocean on Earth, and developed rich, complex societies on some of the most remote islands in the world. To reduce this achievement to a footnote in the story of Mu is an injustice. Second, the legend of Mu has contributed to a broader culture of pseudo-historical thinking that undermines public trust in science and scholarship. When people are taught that mainstream scholars are hiding the truth about the past, that there are secret tablets, suppressed evidence, and forbidden knowledge that the establishment refuses to acknowledge, they are being trained to distrust the very institutions that produce reliable knowledge about the world. This distrust has consequences that extend far beyond the question of lost continents. It affects public attitudes toward climate science, toward medicine, toward evolution, and toward any field in which expert knowledge conflicts with popular belief. Third, the racial dimensions of the Mu legend, the idea that a white race was the source of all civilization, have contributed, however modestly, to the broader current of racist pseudoscience that has plagued the modern world. Churchward was not a hateful man, and there is no evidence that he intended his theories to serve a racist agenda. But ideas have consequences beyond the intentions of their creators, and the idea that non-European peoples could not have achieved their cultural accomplishments without help from a mythical white civilization has been used again and again to justify the subjugation and exploitation of non-European peoples. These are not trivial concerns. They remind us that the stories we tell about the past have real consequences in the present. Getting history right matters not just for its own sake, but because our understanding of the past shapes our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with each other. Interlude, a moment of reflection. We have now traced the story of Mu from its origins in a 19th century mistranslation to its elaboration by James Churchward in the 1920s, and we have examined the evidence, or rather, the lack of evidence, for the continent's existence. We have looked at the geological, archaeological, and linguistic arguments against Mu, and we have explored the psychological and cultural factors that have kept the legend alive despite the overwhelming weight of evidence against it. In the second part of this documentary, we will go deeper. We will examine the specific claims Churchward made about the relationship between Mu and the civilizations of Egypt, India, and the Pacific Islands, and we will see how real scholarship has explained the phenomena that Churchward attributed to Mu. We will look at the modern revival of Mu-related theories in the age of the internet and alternative media. We will explore the broader question of how pseudohistory affects our understanding of the past and our ability to think critically about the present. And we will ask, finally, what the legend of Mu can teach us about ourselves, about our deepest fears, our deepest longings, and our endless, restless search for meaning in the mystery of the past. But before we move on, let us pause for a moment and consider the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is the largest single feature on the surface of the Earth. It is so vast that all of the world's continents could fit within it with room to spare. It is so deep that in the Mariana Trench, the ocean floor lies nearly 7 miles below the surface, a depth so extreme that if Mount Everest were placed in the trench, its peak would still be more than a mile underwater. The Pacific is home to an astonishing diversity of life. Whales and dolphins, sharks and rays, coral reefs of staggering beauty, and deep-sea creatures so strange they seem to belong to another world. It is crisscrossed by currents that regulate the climate of the entire planet. It is dotted with islands that range from tropical paradises to barren volcanic rocks, and it has been home for thousands of years to some of the most resilient, creative, and courageous peoples on Earth. The Pacific does not need a lost continent to make it interesting. It does not need Mu to give it meaning. The real Pacific, with its real history, its real cultures, its real wonders, is more than enough. And yet the dream of Mu persists. It persists because we are human, and because being human means living in a state of permanent uncertainty about the past, permanent anxiety about the present, and permanent hope for the future. The story of Mu speaks to all three of these conditions. It tells us that the past was grander than we know, that the present is poorer than it should be, and that the future might be better if only we can recover what was lost. It is a beautiful dream. But it is a dream, and the waking world, with all its complexity and ambiguity and imperfection, is where we must live. Chapter 19. The Naacal Brotherhood myth within a myth. One of the most intriguing elements of Churchward's narrative was his description of the Naacal Brotherhood, the priestly order that he claimed had served as the guardians of knowledge in the civilization of Mu. Understanding Churchward's concept of the Naacal reveals much about the intellectual traditions he was drawing on and the kind of story he was trying to tell. According to Churchward, the Naacal were a group of priest scholars who held the highest rank in the civilization of Mu. They were the custodians of all religious, scientific, and historical knowledge. They presided over the temples of Mu, conducted rituals, taught the young, and maintained the records of the civilization in the form of the Naacal tablets, the very tablets that Churchward claimed to have seen in India. The Naacal, Churchward said, were not confined to Mu itself. They were missionaries and colonizers who traveled from the motherland to distant shores, establishing temples and schools wherever they went. It was the Naacal who brought the knowledge of Mu to India, to Burma, to Egypt, to Central and South and North. Wherever the great civilizations of the ancient world arose, Churchward claimed, the Naacal had been there first, planting the seeds of culture and religion that would eventually blossom into the civilizations known to history. After the destruction of Mu, according to Churchward, the surviving Naacal went underground, literally and figuratively. They retreated to hidden temples and monasteries, preserving their knowledge in secret, passing it down from generation to generation through a chain of initiated priests. The rishi who showed Churchward the tablets in India was, Churchward implied, the last link in this chain, or one of the last links at least. This narrative bears a striking resemblance to several other esoteric traditions. The idea of a secret brotherhood of initiated priests preserving ancient wisdom through the centuries is a staple of Western esotericism. It appears in Freemasonry, in Rosicrucianism, in Theosophy, and in countless other mystical and occult traditions. The Theosophical concept of the masters or Mahatmas, spiritually advanced beings who guide human evolution from behind the scenes, is essentially the same idea in a different guise. So is the Rosicrucian legend of a secret society founded by a mysterious figure named Christian Rosencreutz, who supposedly traveled to the East and brought back secret knowledge. Churchward was almost certainly aware of these traditions, and his Naacal brotherhood seems to be modeled on them. The Naacal serve the same function in Churchward's narrative that the Mahatmas serve in Theosophy. They are the guarantors of authenticity, the link between the present and the lost golden age, the proof that the ancient wisdom has not been entirely lost. But the Naacal, like the Mahatmas, are unfalsifiable. They cannot be located, they cannot be interviewed, their temples cannot be visited, their tablets cannot be examined. They exist only in the narrative of the person who claims to have encountered them, and that narrative cannot be independently verified. This is a crucial point, and it applies not just to Churchward's Naacal but to all claims of secret knowledge and hidden brotherhoods. The appeal of such claims lies precisely in their secrecy, in the thrilling sense that there is a hidden layer of reality, a secret truth known only to a select few, lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary life. But secrecy is also the perfect defense against scrutiny. If the knowledge is secret, it cannot be examined. If it cannot be examined, it cannot be disproved. And if it cannot be disproved, it can be believed forever. The Naacal Brotherhood is a myth within a myth, a story told inside a story, adding an extra layer of mystery and an extra layer of immunity to criticism. It is a brilliant narrative device, and it is entirely fictional. Chapter 20: What Mu tells us about the human condition. As we approach the end of the first part of our exploration, let us step back from the specific claims and counterclaims and consider what the legend of Mu tells us about the broader human condition. The story of Mu is ultimately a story about loss. It is about the sense, felt perhaps by every human being who has ever lived, that something precious has been taken from us. That the world was once whole and is now broken. That we are exiles from a home we can barely remember, wandering through a diminished world, carrying in our hearts a faint, aching memory of a place where everything was as it should be. This sense of loss is not unique to believers in Mu. It is one of the defining features of the human experience. We feel it when we think about our childhoods, which seem, in memory, to have been brighter and simpler than the complicated present. We feel it when we contemplate the natural world, which seems, with every passing year, to be diminished and degraded by human activity. We feel it when we look at the great monuments of the past, the pyramids, the cathedrals, the ancient temples, and wonder whether we have lost the ability to create things of such enduring beauty and power. Mu is a symbol of this loss, a concrete image onto which we can project our vague, formless sense of having been robbed of something we cannot name. It gives our longing a shape, a name, a location. It tells us that the paradise we dream of was real, that it existed in a specific time and place, and that its destruction was a historical event rather than a metaphysical condition. This concreteness is part of its appeal. It is easier to grieve for a lost continent than to grieve for a lost sense of wholeness. But the legend of Mu also tells us something else, something less comfortable. It tells us about our capacity for self-deception. About our ability to construct elaborate, internally consistent, emotionally satisfying narratives that have no basis in reality. About the ease with which we can convince ourselves that we know things we do not know, that we have evidence we do not have, and that the truth has been hidden from us by forces we cannot see. This capacity for self-deception is not a defect. It is a feature of the human mind, a byproduct of the same cognitive abilities that allow us to imagine, to create, to plan, and to dream. The same brain that can envision a lost continent can also envision a bridge, a symphony, a constitution, or a cure for a disease. Imagination is our greatest tool, but it is also our greatest liability. It allows us to see what is not there, and sometimes we mistake the vision for reality. The story of Mu, then, is a cautionary tale, a reminder that the line between imagination and reality is thinner than we like to think, and that crossing that line, however pleasurable it may feel, has consequences. It is a reminder that the past is not a canvas on which we can paint whatever pictures we like. The past is real. The people who lived in it were real. Their achievements were real, and they deserve to be remembered as they were, not as we wish they had been. When we return for the second part of this documentary, we will explore the specific ways in which the Mu narrative has been dismantled by modern science, the surprising places where echoes of the Mu legend can still be found in contemporary culture, and the final, essential question: what do we owe to the truth about our past? The story of Mu is far from over. Its echoes reverberate through our culture, through our psychology, through our unending human desire to understand where we came from and what we have lost along the way. The waters of the Pacific keep their secrets, but the truth, as always, is more extraordinary than any legend. The continent that never was still has much to teach us, not about the past, but about ourselves. Welcome back. In the first part of this documentary, we trace the origins of the Mu legend from its roots in 19th century mistranslation through the elaborate fantasies of James Churchward. We examine the geological impossibility of a sunken Pacific continent, the psychological forces that make lost continent narratives so seductive, and the real history of the Pacific and its peoples, a history far more extraordinary than any myth. Now, in this second and final part, we go deeper. We follow the tendrils of the Mu legend into the civilizations Churchward claimed it had founded. We watch as modern science, discipline by discipline, dismantles every pillar of the lost continent hypothesis. We explore the strange afterlife of Mu in the 20th and 21st centuries, and we ask at last the question that has hovered over this entire investigation: what do we owe to the truth about our past, and what do we lose when we surrender that truth to fantasy? Chapter 21, Mu and Egypt, the colony that never was. Of all the claims James Churchward made about the reach and influence of Mu, perhaps the most audacious was his assertion that ancient Egypt was a colony of the lost Pacific continent. According to Churchward, the civilization of the Nile, its pyramids, its temples, its hieroglyphic script, its elaborate religion of gods and afterlife, was not an independent creation of the Egyptian people. It was a transplant. A cutting from the great tree of Mu, carried westward across the Indian Ocean by Naacal missionaries and planted in the fertile soil of the Nile Delta, where it grew into the magnificent civilization known to history. This claim was central to Churchward's argument because Egypt was and remains one of the most impressive and most studied civilizations of the ancient world. If Churchward could demonstrate a connection between Egypt and Mu, he would have linked his hypothetical continent to one of the most powerful symbols of ancient achievement in the popular imagination. Egypt was the proof that Mu was real, or so Churchward believed. Let us examine this claim in detail. Churchward pointed to several features of Egyptian civilization that he said demonstrated its Mu origins. First, the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, Churchward argued, was not an Egyptian invention but a Mu invention, brought to Egypt by colonists from the Motherland. The pyramid shape, he said, was one of the sacred symbols of Mu, representing the cosmic forces that the Naacal priesthood had mastered. The fact that pyramids also appeared in Mesoamerica, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere was, for Churchward, proof that all of these cultures had received the pyramid concept from the same source. Second, Churchward pointed to Egyptian religious symbolism. He identified several Egyptian symbols, the Ankh, the Eye of Horus, the winged sun disk, the scarab, as variants of the sacred symbols of Mu. The Egyptian worship of Ra, the sun god, was, he said, a continuation of the monotheistic sun worship practiced on Mu. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife, with its elaborate rituals of mummification and its vision of a journey through the underworld, was a degraded form of the original Mu religion, which had taught the immortality of the soul and the unity of all life in the cosmic creative force. Third, Churchward pointed to the Sphinx. This enigmatic monument, with its human head and lion body gazing eternally across the desert, was, Churchward suggested, far older than mainstream Egyptologists believed and was connected to the symbolism of Mu. These claims sound dramatic, but they collapse under the weight of actual Egyptological evidence. Let us begin with the pyramids. The development of the Egyptian pyramid can be traced, step by step, through the archaeological record. The earliest Egyptian monumental tombs were mastabas, flat-topped, rectangular structures made of mud brick, used as burial places for the elite during the early dynastic period, around 3100 to 2686 BC. The transition from mastaba to pyramid began with the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2630 BC by the architect Imhotep. The step pyramid is essentially a stack of progressively smaller mastabas placed on top of each other, a logical and visually striking extension of the existing tomb building tradition. From the step pyramid, the development continued through a series of experimental forms, the bent pyramid and the red pyramid at Dahshur, built by Pharaoh Sneferu, before culminating in the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, built around 2560 BC. Each step in this development is documented in the archaeological record. We can see the architects learning from their mistakes, refining their techniques, and gradually perfecting the pyramid form over a period of about a century. This is not the signature of a technology imported whole from a distant continent. This is the signature of a technology developed locally, through trial and error, by people who were inventing as they went. If the Egyptians had received the pyramid concept from Mu, fully formed and ready to use, we would not expect to see this gradual, experimental development. We would expect to see perfect pyramids appearing suddenly, without precedent in the archaeological record. Instead, we see exactly the opposite, a slow, logical, entirely human process of innovation. The same is true of Egyptian religious symbolism. The Egyptian religion was not a monolithic system that appeared fully formed at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. It was a complex, evolving tradition that developed over thousands of years, incorporating local cults, regional traditions, and philosophical innovations. The worship of Ra, the sun god, was not the original Egyptian religion. It was a relatively late development, gaining prominence during the Old Kingdom and reaching its peak during the New Kingdom. Earlier Egyptian religion was focused on local deities, animal cults, and fertility rituals that have no obvious connection to Churchward's alleged Mu religion. The symbols that Churchward identified as Mu symbols, the Ankh, the Eye of Horus, the winged sun disk, are well understood within the context of Egyptian culture. The Ankh is a symbol of life, possibly derived from a sandal strap or a knot. The Eye of Horus is associated with the myth of Horus and Seth, a distinctly Egyptian narrative. The winged sun disk represents the sun god in his aspect as protector of the pharaoh. These symbols have specific meanings within Egyptian culture, meanings that have been established through centuries of careful scholarship. To strip them of their Egyptian context and declare them to be Mu symbols is an act of intellectual violence, a distortion of the evidence to serve a predetermined conclusion. As for the Sphinx, its age and origin have been debated, but the mainstream archaeological consensus, supported by geological, archaeological, and historical evidence, places its construction during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BC. Claims that the Sphinx is much older, based on alleged water erosion patterns on its body, have been put forward by some researchers but have not been accepted by the majority of geologists and Egyptologists who have examined the evidence. And even if the Sphinx were older than currently believed, this would not demonstrate a connection to Mu. It would simply push back the date of a distinctly Egyptian monument. The fundamental problem with Churchward's Egypt-Mu connection is that it is unnecessary. Egyptian civilization does not need an external source to explain its existence. The archaeological record shows a clear, continuous development of Egyptian culture from the pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom and beyond. We can trace the evolution of Egyptian art, architecture, writing, religion, and social organization through thousands of artifacts, inscriptions, and monuments. There are no gaps in this record that require a lost continent to fill. Egypt was built by Egyptians, using Egyptian ideas, Egyptian skills, and Egyptian labor. To suggest otherwise is to deny the evidence and to diminish the achievement. Chapter 22, Mu and India, the mystical connection. India held a special place in Churchward's narrative, for it was in India that he claimed to have discovered the Naacal tablets, the foundation of his entire system. According to Churchward, India was one of the earliest and most important colonies of Mu. The Naacal missionaries had traveled from Mu to India, bringing with them the sacred knowledge of the motherland and establishing temples and schools where that knowledge was preserved. Churchward claimed that the ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, contained coded references to Mu and its teachings. He interpreted Hindu myths and symbols in terms of his Mu framework, arguing that the Hindu concepts of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva were distorted memories of the original Mu religion, and that the Hindu concept of cosmic cycles, the yugas or ages of the world, was a garbled version of the Mu account of the creation and destruction of the motherland. He also claimed that the great epics of India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, contained hidden references to Mu, and that the Vimanas described in these texts, flying vehicles used by gods and heroes, were memories of the advanced technology of the Mu civilization. These claims are, like Churchward's claims about Egypt, based on a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of the source material. Indian civilization, like Egyptian civilization, has a long, well-documented history that does not require an external origin to explain. The earliest known civilization in the Indian subcontinent, the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, flourished from approximately 3300 to 1300 BC in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. It was one of the great urban civilizations of the ancient world, with well-planned cities, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and a script that has not yet been deciphered. The Indus Valley Civilization was followed by the Vedic period, during which the Vedas, the oldest scriptures of Hinduism, were composed. The Vedas are a vast body of religious literature, composed in Sanskrit over a period of several centuries, beginning around 1500 BC. They contain hymns, rituals, philosophical speculations, and mythological narratives that reflect the beliefs and practices of the early Indo-Aryan peoples who migrated into the Indian subcontinent from Central Asia. The Hindu religion, as it exists today, is the product of thousands of years of development, incorporating elements from the Indus Valley Civilization, from the Vedic tradition, from local and regional cults, and from centuries of philosophical and theological reflection. It is a rich, complex, and deeply rooted tradition that belongs to the people of India and does not need, and does not benefit from, an imaginary connection to a lost Pacific continent. Churchward's interpretation of Hindu texts was based on a superficial and selective reading. He picked out elements that seemed to support his theory, references to a great land, to a motherland, to a catastrophic flood, and ignored the vast majority of the texts which deal with matters entirely unrelated to Mu. His claim that the Vimanas were memories of Mu technology is a particularly egregious example of this selective reading. The Vimanas are mythological vehicles, described in texts that are explicitly mythological in character. To treat them as historical evidence of advanced technology is to confuse mythology with history, the same error that underlies the entire Mu narrative. Moreover, Churchward's claim that he learned the Naacal language from a Hindu rishi in India raises serious questions. No such language has ever been identified by linguists. No inscriptions in this language have ever been found by archaeologists. No scholar of Indian languages or Indian history has ever encountered any reference to the Naacal language or the Naacal tablets outside of Churchward's own writings. The entire edifice of the India-Mu connection rests on the unverifiable testimony of a single man. This is not how knowledge works. In any legitimate field of inquiry, whether science, history, or linguistics, claims must be supported by evidence that can be examined, tested, and verified by others. A claim that cannot be independently verified is not knowledge, it is assertion. An assertion, no matter how confidently made, is not proof. Chapter 23, Mu and Mesoamerica, the Maya connection revisited. We have already traced the origins of the word mu to Brasseur de Bourbourg's mistranslation of the Trono Codex, and we have noted Augustus Le Plongeon's extravagant claims about the Maya as descendants of Mu. But Churchward took these claims further, weaving the Maya and other Mesoamerican civilizations into his grand narrative of Mu's global influence. Churchward claimed that the Maya civilization was a direct descendant of Mu. He pointed to Maya architecture, the pyramids, the temples, the elaborate carved facades as evidence of Mu influence. He cited the Maya calendar with its complex cycles and its deep time calculations as a survival of the astronomical knowledge of Mu. He interpreted Maya glyphs as variants of the Naacal script and claimed to have translated Maya inscriptions that confirmed the existence of the Motherland. He also drew heavily on the Niven tablets, the stone tablets found in the Valley of Mexico by William Niven, which he claimed were inscribed in the Naacal language and contained records of the Mu civilization. The reality, once again, is very different from Churchward's narrative. The Maya civilization is one of the most extraordinary achievements of human history. Flourishing in the lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras from roughly 2000 BC to the time of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, the Maya developed a fully phonetic writing system, the only fully developed writing system in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. They made remarkable advances in astronomy, mathematics, including the independent invention of the concept of zero, architecture, art, and agriculture. The development of Maya civilization can be traced through the archaeological record with considerable precision. From the earliest agricultural villages of the preclassic period through the great city-states of the classic period, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Kapan, to the post-classic centers like Chichen Itza and Mayapan, we can follow the growth, flowering, and transformation of Maya culture over more than 3,000 years. There are no gaps in this record that require an external source to explain. The Maya developed their civilization independently, drawing on their own genius, their own environment, and their own cultural traditions. The decipherment of the Maya script, which was essentially completed in the second half of the 20th century through the work of scholars like Yuri Norzov, Tatyana Proskuryakov, Linda Scheel, David Stewart, and many others, has been one of the greatest intellectual achievements of modern scholarship. We can now read the vast majority of Maya inscriptions, and they tell us a great deal about Maya history, politics, religion, and daily life. And they say nothing about Mu. The Maya inscriptions record the deeds of kings and queens, the dates of battles and ceremonies, the genealogies of royal families, the movements of celestial bodies, and the rituals performed to honor the gods. They describe a world that is entirely and unmistakably Maya, a world of divine kings, sacred caves, bloodletting rituals, and a cosmos organized around the world tree. There is no reference to a lost continent, no mention of the Naacal, no hint of an overseas motherland. Churchward's claim to have translated Maya inscriptions was based on the same flawed methodology that had produced Brasseur de Bourbourg's and Le Plongeon's pseudo-translations. The use of Landa's broken alphabet to assign arbitrary meanings to glyphs whose actual values were completely different. Now that we can actually read the Maya script, we can see clearly that Churchward's translations were pure fantasy. As for the Niven tablets, their status remains ambiguous. Some of them may be genuine pre-Columbian artifacts, others may be forgeries, but none of them, when examined by qualified scholars, have been found to contain references to Mu or to any language that can be identified as Naacal. Churchward's interpretation of these tablets was, like his interpretation of everything else, determined by his pre-existing theory rather than by the evidence itself. The Maya did not need Mu. They were one of the most creative and intellectually sophisticated peoples in the history of our species. Their achievements in mathematics, astronomy, writing, and art are a testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human mind, not the mind of some mythical lost race, but the mind of the Maya themselves, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, building a civilization that endures in stone and in memory to this day. Chapter 24, Mu and the Pacific Islands, Stealing the Polynesian story. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of the Mu legend is its treatment of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands. Churchward claimed that the Polynesians, Micronesians, and Melanesians were the descendants of Mu, the scattered survivors of the continent's destruction, living on the mountain peaks and highland plateaus that had remained above the waves when the rest of Mu sank. This claim has a long and troubling history. From the earliest European contact with the Pacific Islands, European observers struggled to explain how the islands had been populated. The vastness of the Pacific, the remoteness of many islands, and the relatively simple technology of the island peoples, at least as Europeans perceived it, made it seem impossible that these people could have navigated the open ocean and colonized thousands of islands spread across millions of square miles. The European response, shaped by the racial assumptions of the colonial era, was to deny that the Pacific Islanders had accomplished this feat. Instead, Europeans proposed various theories of external origin. The islanders were descendants of Noah, or of lost tribes, or of shipwrecked sailors from civilized countries, or of refugees from a sunken continent. The idea that brown-skinned peoples in outrigger canoes could have deliberately navigated the largest ocean on Earth and colonized it, island by island, was simply too much for many Europeans to accept. Churchward's Mu theory was a late expression of this colonial denial. By attributing the colonization of the Pacific to a lost white civilization, Churchward effectively erased the real achievement of Polynesian navigators and replaced it with a fantasy that placed white people at the center of Pacific history. The truth, as we discussed in Part 1, is far more impressive than any fantasy. The colonization of the Pacific by Polynesian navigators was one of the most remarkable achievements in all of human history. Using double-hulled canoes, sophisticated knowledge of stars and ocean currents, and extraordinary courage, Polynesian voyagers crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to reach and settle islands across an area larger than any continent. We now know a great deal about how this was accomplished, thanks to decades of research in archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and experimental navigation. The evidence is clear and convergent. Polynesian expansion began in Southeast Asia and moved eastward island by island over a period of roughly 3,000 years. The dates, the routes, and the methods are well established. There is no need to invoke a lost continent. The oral traditions of Polynesian peoples, which Churchward misinterpreted as memories of Mu, are now understood within their proper cultural context. The Maori tradition of Hawaii, for example, refers not to a sunken continent but to an ancestral homeland in central Polynesia, a real place or a composite memory of real places from which the ancestors of the Maori departed on their voyage to New Zealand. Similar traditions in other Polynesian cultures refer to real islands, real ancestors, and real voyages. They are records of a genuine and extraordinary migration, not fragments of a Mu myth. The genetic evidence tells the same story. DNA studies of Pacific Island populations have traced their ancestry to Southeast Asia, with a clear pattern of eastward migration that matches the archaeological and linguistic evidence. There is no genetic trace of a lost Pacific continent or of a mysterious white race that preceded the Polynesians. The study of Polynesian navigation has revealed a body of knowledge so sophisticated that it commands the admiration of modern scientists. Polynesian navigators could read the stars, the wind, the waves, the clouds, the flight paths of birds, and the color and temperature of the water to determine their position and course with remarkable accuracy. They had mental maps of the ocean, charts of stars, islands, and currents carried in their minds that allowed them to navigate across thousands of miles without instruments. In the 1970s, a Hawaiian canoe called Hokule was built using traditional Polynesian designs and navigated from Hawaii to Tahiti and back using only traditional wayfinding techniques, with no modern instruments. The voyage demonstrated conclusively that Polynesian navigation was not a matter of luck or accident, but of skill and knowledge. It was a triumph of human ingenuity, and it destroyed the last vestiges of the colonial myth that Pacific Islanders could not have colonized the ocean on their own. To replace this real, magnificent achievement with the fantasy of Mu is not just an intellectual error, it is a moral failing. It denies agency and genius to peoples who demonstrated both in abundance. It replaces truth with fiction, reality with romance, and in doing so, it diminishes our understanding of what human beings are capable of. Chapter 25. The Yonaguni Monument, Mu in the Modern Age in 1987. A Japanese dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake discovered a remarkable underwater rock formation near the island of Yonaguni, at the southwestern tip of the Japanese archipelago. The formation, which lies at a depth of about 25 meters, consists of a series of flat terraces, sharp edges, and right-angle steps that, to many observers, look strikingly artificial, like the ruins of a massive stone structure submerged beneath the sea. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be called, immediately attracted attention from alternative historians and lost continent enthusiasts. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, studied the formation extensively and concluded that it was a man-made structure, possibly a temple or a ceremonial platform built by a lost civilization thousands of years ago, when sea levels were lower and the formation would have been above water. Kimura suggested that the Yonaguni Monument might be evidence of Churchward's Mu or a related lost civilization. The claim was electrifying. Here at last seemed to be physical, tangible evidence of a sunken civilization in the Pacific, the smoking gun that Mu enthusiasts had been seeking for decades. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, diving expeditions were organized. The Yonaguni Monument became one of the most famous underwater sites in the world, a magnet for divers, researchers, and seekers of the lost and the mysterious. But the evidence is far less clear-cut than the headlines suggest. Other geologists who have examined the Yonaguni Formation have reached a different conclusion from Kimura. Robert Schoch, a geologist known for his controversial claims about the age of the Sphinx, visited the site and concluded that the formation was primarily natural, shaped by the geological processes of erosion and tectonic activity that are common in the region. The flat terraces and sharp edges, Schoch and others have argued, are the result of the natural fracturing patterns of the sandstone from which the formation is composed. Sandstone in this area tends to fracture along straight lines and at right angles, producing shapes that look artificial to the untrained eye but are in fact entirely natural. The debate continues, and it is a legitimate scientific debate. There are features of the Yonaguni Formation that are difficult to explain by natural processes alone, and there are features that are difficult to explain by human construction. The truth may lie somewhere in between. The formation may be a natural rock feature that was modified or utilized by humans at some point in the past, or it may be entirely natural. Further research is needed. But what is not legitimate is the leap from "there is an interesting underwater rock formation near Yonaguni" to Mu existed. Even if the Yonaguni Monument were conclusively proven to be artificial, this would not prove the existence of a Pacific continent. It would prove that there was a human settlement near Yonaguni at a time when sea levels were lower, a conclusion that is interesting but far from extraordinary, given that sea levels have fluctuated significantly over the last 20,000 years and that coastal settlements around the world have been submerged by rising seas. The Yonaguni Monument is a fascinating geological and possibly archaeological puzzle, but it is not evidence of Mu. The intellectual leap required to go from an underwater rock formation to a sunken continent is immense, and it is not supported by the evidence. Chapter 26, the Madol Enigma. If there is one site in the Pacific that has done more than any other to fuel speculation about lost civilizations, it is Madol, the extraordinary ruins that lie off the coast of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia. Madol is a complex of nearly 100 artificial islands, built on a coral reef in a shallow lagoon, connected by a network of canals. The islands are constructed of massive basalt columns, natural prismatic crystals formed by the cooling of volcanic lava, stacked in a log cabin pattern to form walls, platforms, and enclosures. Some of these columns weigh several tons, and the total volume of basalt used in the construction of Madol has been estimated at 750,000 metric tons. The scale of Madol is staggering, especially given its remote location. Pohnpei is a small volcanic island in the central Pacific, far from any mainland. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and stack the enormous basalt columns is impressive by any standard. And the question of why would the inhabitants of a small Pacific island invest such enormous labor in building a city of artificial islands on a coral reef, has exercised the imaginations of visitors and researchers for centuries. European explorers who encountered Madol in the 19th century were astonished by the ruins and immediately began speculating about their origin. Some suggested that they were the work of a lost race of giants. Others proposed that they had been built by colonists from a distant civilization. And when Churchward's Mu theory became popular, Madol was quickly incorporated into the narrative as evidence of Mu's existence. The reasoning was familiar. The local people, living in relatively simple societies, could not possibly have built something so impressive. Therefore, someone else must have built it, and that someone else must have been the lost civilization of Mu. This reasoning is, as we have seen, both factually wrong and morally problematic. Archaeological research at Madol, conducted over several decades by scholars including William Ayres, Rufino Mauricio, and others, has established a clear picture of the site's history and construction. Madol was built by the ancestors of the present-day Pohnpeian people over a period of several centuries, beginning around 1200 AD and reaching its peak between 1200 and 1500 AD. It served as the ceremonial and political center of the Saudeleur dynasty, a line of rulers who governed Pohnpei for several hundred years. The site was used for royal residences, temples, tombs, and administrative functions. The construction techniques used at Madol, while impressive, are well within the capabilities of a well-organized human community with access to the necessary raw materials. The basalt columns used in the construction occur naturally on Pohnpei, formed by the cooling of volcanic lava. They were quarried from outcrops on the island and transported to the construction site by raft, using the island's rivers and the lagoon. The stacking technique, placing the columns in alternating layers, like a log cabin, is structurally efficient and does not require advanced technology or knowledge beyond what the Pohnpeian builders possessed. Recent studies using radiocarbon dating and archaeological survey have confirmed that Madol was built incrementally, over a period of several centuries, with each successive ruler adding to and modifying the complex. This gradual cumulative construction process is entirely consistent with a local origin and does not require an external source of knowledge or labor. Madol is a remarkable achievement, one of the most impressive architectural accomplishments of the pre-contact Pacific, but it is a Pohnpeian achievement, not a Mu achievement. The people of Pohnpei built Madol with their own hands, their own knowledge, and their own labor. To deny them credit for this accomplishment is to perpetuate the colonial fiction that Pacific Islanders were incapable of creating great works on their own. Chapter 27, The Plate Tectonics Revolution. The final nail. We discussed the basics of plate tectonics in Part 1, but the importance of this scientific revolution for the Mu debate cannot be overstated. Plate tectonics did not merely undermine the Mu hypothesis, it rendered it physically impossible. The theory of plate tectonics was developed in the 1960s, building on earlier work by Alfred Wegener, Harry Hess, and others. It holds that the Earth's outer shell, the lithosphere, is divided into a number of rigid plates that move relative to each other on the underlying asthenosphere. These plates are of two types: continental plates, composed of relatively thick, light continental crust, and oceanic plates, composed of thinner, denser oceanic crust. The key insight of plate tectonics for our purposes is that continental crust and oceanic crust are fundamentally different and cannot be interchanged. Continental crust is composed primarily of granite and related rocks. It is relatively thick, typically 30 to 50 kilometers, and relatively light. Oceanic crust is composed primarily of basalt. It is thinner, typically 5 to 10 kilometers, and denser. Because continental crust is lighter than oceanic crust, it floats higher on the asthenosphere, rising above sea level to form the continents. Oceanic crust, being denser, lies lower, forming the floors of the ocean basins. This is why there are continents and oceans, not by accident, but because of the fundamental density difference between the two types of crust. A continent cannot sink beneath the ocean because continental crust is buoyant. It floats on the denser material beneath it, just as a wooden block floats on water. You can push a wooden block underwater, but the moment you release it, it pops back up. The same is true of continental crust. The forces of gravity and buoyancy ensure that continental crust always rides high on the asthenosphere, above the level of the ocean floor. Churchward's explanation for the sinking of Mu, that the continent was supported by underground gas chambers that collapsed, has no basis in geological reality. There are no such gas chambers beneath the Earth's surface. The Earth's interior is composed of solid and semi-solid rock, not gas-filled cavities. The idea of a continent collapsing into empty space beneath it is a fantasy that contradicts everything we know about the structure of the Earth. Furthermore, the floor of the Pacific Ocean has been thoroughly mapped and studied. If a continent had once existed in the Pacific, its geological signature would be unmistakable. There would be vast areas of continental crust on the ocean floor, surrounded by oceanic crust. There would be sedimentary deposits, river sediments, lake beds, terrestrial fossils that are characteristic of continental environments. There would be geological structures, folds, faults, mountain ranges that are associated with continental crust. None of this exists. The Pacific Ocean floor is composed entirely of oceanic crust, produced at mid-ocean ridges and spreading outward as new crust is formed. This is consistent with plate tectonic theory and completely inconsistent with the existence of a sunken continent. The evidence from deep-sea drilling is equally definitive. Since the late 1960s, the deep-sea drilling project and its successor, the Ocean Drilling Program, have drilled hundreds of cores from the Pacific Ocean floor. These cores provide a detailed record of the geological history of the ocean basin, stretching back tens of millions of years. Not a single core has ever yielded evidence of continental crust or continental sediments in the central Pacific. The record is clear: the Pacific has been an ocean basin for as long as the rocks can tell us. The islands of the Pacific, the very islands that Churchward claimed were the remnants of Mu, are volcanic in origin. They were formed by volcanic eruptions on the ocean floor, not by the fragmentation of a continent. The Hawaiian Islands, the Society Islands, the Marquesas, Easter Island, and the countless other islands of the Pacific are all volcanic formations, produced by the geological processes of plate tectonics and hotspot volcanism. They have never been part of a continent. They rose from the sea floor and in many cases are slowly sinking back into it, not because a continent is collapsing, but because the oceanic crust on which they sit is cooling, contracting, and subsiding over time. Plate tectonics is not a theory in the colloquial sense. It is not a guess or a speculation. It is one of the most thoroughly tested and confirmed theories in all of science, supported by an enormous body of evidence from geology, geophysics, paleontology, and oceanography. To reject plate tectonics in favor of Churchward's gas chamber hypothesis is like rejecting the germ theory of disease in favor of the idea that illness is caused by evil spirits. It is a retreat from knowledge into ignorance. Chapter 28, The Age of the Internet, Mu reborn. If the mid-20th century seemed likely to be the death of the Mu legend, killed by plate tectonics, by the decipherment of the Maya script, by the mapping of the ocean floor, by the systematic debunking of Churchward's claims, the late 20th and early 21st centuries proved otherwise. The age of the Internet has given Mu a new life. The Internet is, in many ways, the perfect medium for pseudo-historical claims. It allows anyone with a keyboard to publish their ideas to a global audience without the filters of peer review, editorial oversight, or institutional accountability. It creates echo chambers in which like-minded believers can reinforce each other's convictions without encountering dissenting views. It rewards sensationalism and controversy over accuracy and nuance. And it makes it easy to create slick, professional-looking content, websites, videos, podcasts, that can be difficult for a casual viewer to distinguish from legitimate scholarship. In this environment, the legend of Mu has proliferated. A simple internet search for Mu lost continent yields millions of results, ranging from earnest blogs by true believers to elaborate conspiracy theories linking Mu to ancient aliens, government cover-ups, and mystical prophecies. YouTube is filled with documentaries, many of them skillfully produced, with dramatic music, compelling narration, and impressive graphics, that present the Mu theory as though it were a legitimate alternative to mainstream scholarship. Many of these modern presentations of the Mu theory go far beyond anything Churchward ever claimed. Some argue that the people of Mu possessed advanced technology, not just Churchward's vague cosmic forces, but actual machines, aircraft, submarines, energy weapons, and devices capable of levitating massive stone blocks. Some link Mu to the ancient alien hypothesis, suggesting that the civilization of Mu was founded or influenced by extraterrestrial beings. Some claim that the knowledge of Mu has been deliberately suppressed by governments and academic institutions as part of a grand conspiracy to keep humanity ignorant of its true history. These claims are, if anything, even less well supported than Churchward's original ones, but they are presented with great confidence and great skill, and they reach an audience of millions. The result is that more people today may believe in Mu than at any time since Churchward's death, not because the evidence for Mu has gotten stronger, but because the barriers to spreading misinformation have gotten weaker. This is a broader problem, of course, that extends far beyond the question of lost continents. The spread of misinformation on the internet affects every area of public life, from health and medicine to politics and economics. The Mu legend is, in this context, a relatively harmless example of the phenomenon, but it is a useful case study because it illustrates the mechanisms by which false claims spread and persist in the digital age. The mechanisms are these. First, the claim is presented in a compelling, emotionally engaging format, a video, a blog post, a social media thread that captures attention and stimulates curiosity. Second, the claim is supported by a selective presentation of evidence, cherry-picked facts, misleading images, out-of-context quotations that creates an impression of solidity. Third, the claim is framed as a challenge to established authority, what they don't want you to know, the truth the experts are hiding, which appeals to the viewer's desire for independence and critical thinking, even as it actually undermines those qualities. Fourth, the claim is amplified by algorithms that reward engagement, likes, shares, comments, regardless of accuracy. The result is a feedback loop in which false claims are constantly recycled, amplified, and reinforced, while corrections and debunking struggle to gain traction. It is not that people are stupid or gullible. It is that the information environment is structured in a way that favors sensation over substance, narrative over nuance, and emotion over evidence. Chapter 29, The New Age Mu, Lemuria as Spiritual Homeland in the New Age Movement, which emerged in the 1970s and 1980s and continues to thrive today. The legend of Mu, usually blurred with Lemuria, has taken on an entirely new character. No longer primarily a pseudo-historical claim about the deep past, Mu/Lemuria has become a spiritual concept, a symbol of ancient wisdom, cosmic consciousness, and humanity's lost connection to the divine. New Age writers and channels, people who claim to receive messages from spiritual entities, including the spirits of long-dead Lemurians, have produced a vast literature describing the spiritual teachings of Mu. In these accounts, the people of Mu were not just technologically advanced, they were spiritually evolved. They lived in a state of cosmic harmony, deeply attuned to the energies of the earth, the stars, and the universal life force. They communicated telepathically. They healed through the laying on of hands in the direction of spiritual energy. They had no need for war, greed, or conflict because they understood the fundamental unity of all life. The destruction of Mu in these accounts was not merely a geological event. It was a spiritual catastrophe, a fall from grace caused by humanity's growing attachment to the material world and its corresponding loss of spiritual awareness. The sinking of Mu was a consequence of the imbalance between spirit and matter, a cosmic correction that swept away a civilization that had, despite its wisdom, allowed itself to be corrupted. And the spiritual legacy of Mu, these writers say, is still available to us. Through meditation, channeling, crystal work, and other spiritual practices, we can reconnect with the Lemurian energy, access the ancient wisdom of Mu, and begin the process of restoring the spiritual harmony that was lost when the continent sank. This spiritual reinterpretation of Mu is, in many ways, a continuation of the Theosophical tradition that gave birth to the Lemuria concept in the first place. Blavatsky's root races, Steiner's spiritual evolution, and Churchward's Naacal brotherhood all find echoes in the New Age Mu. The details change, the language shifts from Theosophical jargon to New Age vocabulary, from root races to vibrational frequencies, from Mahatmas to channeled entities, but the underlying structure remains the same: a lost golden age, a catastrophic fall, and the possibility of spiritual recovery. From a critical perspective, the New Age Mu is even further removed from evidence and verifiability than Churchward's original version. At least Churchward claimed to base his theory on physical objects, tablets, inscriptions, archaeological sites that could, in principle, be examined. The New Age Mu is based on channeled messages, psychic visions, and subjective spiritual experiences that are, by their nature, immune to verification or falsification. You cannot disprove a channeled message. You cannot test a psychic vision. You cannot argue with a subjective spiritual experience. The claims exist in a realm that is, by definition, beyond the reach of evidence and reason. This does not mean that the people who hold these beliefs are dishonest or deluded. Many of them are sincere, thoughtful, and well-intentioned. They are searching for meaning, connection, and spiritual depth in a world that can feel shallow and meaningless. The legend of Mu provides them with a narrative that meets these needs, a story of ancient wisdom and cosmic harmony that offers hope and purpose. But sincerity is not the same as truth, and the fact that a belief meets emotional needs does not make it factually correct. The challenge for all of us, not just for believers in Mu, is to find ways to meet our emotional and spiritual needs without sacrificing our commitment to truth and evidence. This is not easy, but it is essential. Chapter 30, Race and Lost Continents, the uncomfortable truth. We touched on this topic in Part 1, but it deserves a more thorough examination because the racial dimensions of the Mu legend are not incidental. They are central. Churchward was explicit in his claim that the people of Mu were a white race. He was equally explicit in his claim that this white race had founded the civilizations of Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, and the Pacific Islands. In Churchward's telling, the great achievements of non-European civilizations were not their own. They were gifts from a white motherland. This claim did not originate with Churchward. It is part of a long tradition of racist pseudo-scholarship that stretches back to the early days of European colonialism. When European explorers encountered the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Angkor, the cities of the Maya, and the Moai of Easter Island, they often refused to believe that non-European peoples could have created such wonders. Instead, they proposed external origins, lost tribes, shipwrecked Europeans, or eventually lost continents to explain away the achievements of peoples they considered racially inferior. This tradition has done enormous damage. It has been used to justify colonial exploitation, to deny indigenous peoples credit for their own cultural achievements, and to reinforce the toxic fiction of white racial superiority. The legacy of this tradition is still with us, in the form of persistent popular myths about the inability of non-European peoples to have built their own monuments, developed their own technologies, or created their own civilizations. The ancient alien hypothesis, which has become enormously popular through television shows and online media in recent years, is in many ways a modern continuation of this tradition. When a television presenter stands before the ruins of an ancient non-European civilization and asks, "Could this have been built by ancient astronauts?" the unspoken subtext is often, "These people couldn't have built this on their own." The aliens have replaced the lost white continent, but the underlying logic is the same. The achievements of non-European peoples require an external explanation. This is not to say that everyone who believes in Mu or ancient aliens is a racist. Many believers are genuinely unaware of the racial history of these ideas. They are drawn to the mystery, the romance, and the sense of wonder that these narratives provide, and they do not consciously intend to denigrate any people or culture. But good intentions do not erase harmful effects, and the effect of attributing the achievements of diverse civilizations to a mythical external source, whether that source is a lost continent, an ancient race of whites, or extraterrestrial visitors, is to diminish those civilizations and the peoples who created them. The antidote to this distortion is knowledge, real knowledge based on real evidence about the real achievements of real peoples. The Egyptians built the pyramids. The Maya invented the zero. The Polynesians navigated the Pacific. The people of Pompeii built Madol. These are facts supported by overwhelming evidence, and they are more impressive, more inspiring, and more worthy of wonder than any lost continent fantasy. Chapter 31, The Scientific Method and the Pseudohistorical Method. One of the most important lessons of the Mu story is the difference between the scientific method and the pseudohistorical method. Understanding this difference is crucial, not just for evaluating claims about lost continents, but for navigating the complex information landscape of the modern world. The scientific method is, at its core, a system for testing ideas against evidence. It works like this. A scientist observes something puzzling in the natural world, a pattern, an anomaly, an unexpected result. The scientist formulates a hypothesis, a tentative explanation for the observation. The scientist then designs experiments or investigations to test the hypothesis, looking for evidence that would confirm or refute it. If the evidence supports the hypothesis, the scientist gains confidence in it, but remains open to the possibility that new evidence might require the hypothesis to be revised or abandoned. If the evidence contradicts the hypothesis, the scientist revises or abandons it and tries a new approach. The key features of the scientific method are testability, falsifiability, and self-correction. A scientific hypothesis must make predictions that can be tested against evidence. It must be possible in principle for the hypothesis to be proven wrong, and the scientific community must be willing to abandon hypotheses that fail the test of evidence, no matter how appealing or elegant they may be. The pseudohistorical method works very differently. In pseudohistory, the conclusion comes first. The pseudohistorian begins with a theory: Mu existed, Atlantis was real, aliens built the pyramids, and then searches for evidence that supports the theory while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts it. This is called confirmation bias, and it is the single most common error in human reasoning. We all do it to some degree. We all tend to notice and remember evidence that confirms our existing beliefs while overlooking or forgetting evidence that challenges them. But in science, there are institutional safeguards against confirmation bias: peer review, replication, the demand for transparent methods, and publicly available data. In pseudohistory, there are no such safeguards. The pseudohistorian is free to cherry-pick evidence, misinterpret sources, and ignore contradictory data without facing any professional consequences. Churchward's work is a textbook example of the pseudo-historical method. He began with his conclusion mu existed and then searched the world for evidence that supported it. He found what he was looking for because when you are looking for a specific pattern, you can find it almost anywhere. Pyramids in Egypt, mu. Pyramids in Mexico, mu. Sun symbols in India, mu. Flood myths in Polynesia, mu. Every piece of data, no matter how ambiguous or irrelevant, was interpreted as confirmation of the pre-existing theory. At the same time, Churchward ignored or dismissed the vast body of evidence that contradicted his theory. He ignored the geological evidence against a sunken continent. He ignored the archaeological evidence for the independent development of the civilizations he attributed to mu. He ignored the linguistic evidence that his Naacal language did not exist. He ignored the oceanographic evidence that the Pacific had always been an ocean. This is not scholarship, this is advocacy. And while advocacy has its place in the world, it should not be confused with the search for truth. Chapter 32. The enduring appeal of the lost golden age. Why does the idea of a lost golden age persist, despite the weight of evidence against it? This is a question that goes to the heart of the human condition, and it is worth exploring in depth. The concept of a lost golden age is one of the most universal themes in human culture. We find it everywhere in every era, in virtually every civilization. The Greeks had their golden age, ruled by Kronos, when humans lived without labor, disease, or sorrow. The Romans had their mythic past, when virtue and simplicity had not yet been corrupted by luxury and decadence. Hindu cosmology describes a cycle of 4 ages, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, each worse than the last, with the present era, the Kali Yuga, being the most degraded. Buddhist tradition speaks of a time when human life spans were immeasurably long and moral virtue was universal. Norse mythology describes a primordial world of order and beauty that will eventually be destroyed in the cataclysm of Ragnarök. These are not historical descriptions. They are mythological expressions of a deeply felt human intuition, the sense that the world has declined from some original state of perfection, that we have lost something vital, and that the present is a pale shadow of what once was. Psychologists and anthropologists have proposed various explanations for this nearly universal intuition. Some suggest that it reflects the individual experience of aging. We remember our childhoods as simpler, happier, and more vivid than our adult lives, and we project this personal sense of decline onto the world as a whole. Others suggest that it reflects a cognitive bias toward negativity. We tend to remember past pleasures and forget past pains, creating an idealized picture of the past that contrasts unfavorably with the messy, complicated present. Still others suggest that the lost golden age myth serves a social function, providing a standard of excellence against which the present can be measured and found wanting, thereby motivating reform and improvement. Whatever its origins, the myth of the lost golden age is extraordinarily powerful, and it has a direct bearing on the appeal of lost continent theories. Mu, Atlantis, Lemuria, all of these are, in essence, golden age myths dressed in the clothing of geography and archaeology. They locate the golden age not just in the past, but in a specific place, a place that conveniently no longer exists, which means that its perfection can never be tested against reality. The lost continent is the ultimate unfalsifiable paradise. It was perfect, and you can never visit it to prove otherwise. This is part of the genius of the lost continent narrative. By placing the golden age on a sunken continent, the narrative makes it immune to the most obvious objection. If it was so great, where is it? The answer is always the same. It was destroyed. It sank. It is gone. And because it is gone, we are free to imagine it as perfect without ever having to confront the messy realities that would inevitably accompany any real civilization. Real civilizations, no matter how impressive, are always imperfect. Ancient Egypt was a slave society. The Maya practiced human sacrifice. The The Polynesians fought wars. Every real civilization has its achievements and its atrocities, its beauty and its cruelty, its wisdom and its folly. But Mu, being imaginary, can be anything we want it to be. It can be a paradise of peace and wisdom, a society without conflict or injustice, a world where humanity achieved its full potential. It is the ultimate blank canvas, and we paint it with our deepest longings. Chapter 33, What We Owe to the Past. The question of how we treat the past is not merely an academic one. It is a moral question, and it is one that the legend of Mu forces us to confront. We owe the past accuracy. We owe it the effort of trying to understand what actually happened, rather than projecting our fantasies onto the blank spaces of the archaeological record. We owe it the discipline of distinguishing between what we know, what we believe, and what we wish were true. We owe it respect for the peoples who lived in the past, who struggled and created and suffered and achieved, and who deserve to be remembered as they were, not as we imagine them to have been. When we attribute the achievements of ancient civilizations to a lost continent, we are failing in this moral obligation. We are replacing the real people who built the pyramids, who carved the moai, who navigated the Pacific, who invented writing and mathematics and astronomy with a fantasy. We are erasing real human beings and substituting imaginary ones. We are stealing from the dead, taking credit for their work and giving it to ghosts. This may seem like a harsh judgment, and it is not intended to condemn individuals who believe in Mu. As we have seen, the appeal of the Mu narrative is rooted in deep and universal human needs, the need for meaning, for mystery, for connection to a past that seems grander and more purposeful than the uncertain present. These are valid needs and they deserve to be met, but they can be met without sacrificing truth. The real past is full of wonder. The real achievements of real civilizations are astonishing. The real story of human history, a story of struggle, creativity, resilience, and ingenuity, is more compelling, more inspiring, and more moving than any lost continent fantasy. We do not need Mu to find meaning in the past. We need only to look at what actually happened with open eyes and a willing heart and let the truth speak for itself. Chapter 34, The Legacy of Churchward. A final assessment. James Churchward died in 1936, having spent the last decade of his life promoting his theory of Mu with tireless energy and unshakable conviction. He left behind 5 books, numerous articles, and a body of ideas that continue to circulate, nearly a century later, in the murky waters of pseudohistory and alternative knowledge. What are we to make of Churchward? Was he a charlatan, deliberately fabricating evidence and misleading his readers for profit or fame? Was he a sincere but deluded believer, genuinely convinced that he had discovered the greatest secret in human history? Or was he something in between, a man who started with a genuine sense of wonder and curiosity about the past and gradually slipped, through a combination of wishful thinking, confirmation bias, and the intoxicating power of a good story, into a world of his own creation? The evidence suggests the latter. Churchward does not appear to have been a cynical fraud. He lived modestly, and his books, while they sold well enough, did not make him wealthy. He spent years researching and writing, traveling to libraries and museums, corresponding with scholars and enthusiasts, and defending his ideas against critics. He behaved in many ways like a man who genuinely believed what he was saying, but belief, as we have seen throughout this documentary, is not the same as truth. Churchward believed in Mu because he wanted to believe in Mu. He wanted to believe that the past was grander than the present, that the world had once been unified under a single enlightened civilization, that the mysteries of the ancient world had a single elegant solution. And because he wanted to believe these things, he found evidence for them everywhere he looked, in every inscription and every ruin and every myth. This is the trap of confirmation bias, and it is a trap that any of us can fall into. We are all susceptible to seeing what we want to see, to finding what we are looking for, to constructing narratives that confirm our pre-existing beliefs. The difference between science and pseudoscience is not that scientists are immune to this tendency. They are not, but that science has developed methods and institutions designed to counteract it. Peer review, replication, transparent methodology, the demand for falsifiable predictions, These are the tools that science uses to keep confirmation bias in check. Churchward had none of these tools. He worked alone, without institutional support or peer review. He had no training in the disciplines he cited: geology, archaeology, linguistics, comparative mythology. He relied on his own judgment, his own interpretations, and his own standards of evidence. And the result was exactly what you would expect: a magnificent, elaborate, emotionally satisfying narrative that was, from beginning to end, wrong. Churchward's legacy, then, is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the power of narrative, the seductiveness of mystery, and the danger of believing too strongly in our own stories. It is a reminder that the past is not ours to invent, that evidence matters, and that the truth, however inconvenient or unsatisfying it may sometimes be, is always preferable to the most beautiful lie. Chapter 35, The Ongoing Conversation: Alternative History in the 21st Century. The legend of Mu does not exist in isolation. It is part of a broader cultural phenomenon, the rise of alternative history, that has gained enormous momentum in the 21st century. Alternative history in this context refers to narratives about the past that challenge or reject the consensus of mainstream scholarship. These narratives take many forms: lost continents, ancient aliens, advanced prehistoric civilizations, hidden conspiracies to suppress the truth about the past. They are spread through books, television shows, podcasts, websites, and social media, and they reach an audience that is, in many cases, far larger than the audience for mainstream historical scholarship. The reasons for the popularity of alternative history are complex and varied. Some of them are the same psychological factors we discussed in Part 1: pattern recognition, narrative thinking, the appeal to mystery, distrust of authority, and the need for meaning. But there are also structural factors at work, factors related to the way information is produced, distributed, and consumed in the modern world. One of the most important of these factors is the decline of gatekeeping. In the pre-internet era, the publication of historical claims was mediated by publishers, editors, and peer reviewers, imperfect gatekeepers, to be sure, but gatekeepers nonetheless. A book about a lost continent would have to convince a publisher that it was worth printing, and a publisher might, though did not always, consult experts before making that decision. A claim about ancient history would be subject to review and criticism in academic journals and mainstream media. In the age of the internet, these gatekeepers have been largely bypassed. Anyone can publish anything online, and the audience for that content is determined not by editorial judgment but by algorithmic engagement, by the ability of the content to attract clicks, likes, and shares. Sensational claims about lost continents and ancient aliens are, by their nature, more engaging than careful, nuanced scholarship. They are more shareable, more discussable, more likely to provoke the emotional responses that social media algorithms reward. The result is an information environment in which alternative history thrives, while mainstream scholarship struggles to reach the same audience. A YouTube video about Mu can reach millions of viewers in a matter of days. A peer-reviewed paper debunking the Mu theory might reach a few hundred scholars over a period of years. The playing field is not level, and the advantage belongs to the storytellers, not the truth-tellers. This is not a problem that can be solved by simply debunking individual claims. For every claim that is debunked, 10 new ones appear. The demand for alternative history is not driven by any particular piece of evidence. It is driven by the same deep human needs for meaning, for mystery, for a sense of connection to a grand narrative that have always driven the creation of myths. As long as those needs exist, alternative history will continue to flourish. The solution, if there is one, lies not in debunking but in education, in helping people develop the critical thinking skills they need to evaluate claims about the past and about everything else for themselves. This means teaching people how to distinguish between evidence and assertion, between correlation and causation, between legitimate uncertainty and unfounded speculation. It means helping people understand the scientific method, not as a set of rules imposed by authority, but as a toolkit for thinking clearly and honestly about the world. And it means, perhaps most importantly, showing people that the past revealed by careful, evidence-based scholarship, is not boring or dry or unromantic. It is magnificent. It is full of wonder, surprise, and beauty. The real story of how the pyramids were built, of how the Maya invented the zero, of how Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific, of how the Rosetta Stone was deciphered, these stories are every bit as thrilling as the legend of Mu, and they have the additional virtue of being true. Chapter 36. The waters keep their secrets. What remains unknown? It would be dishonest to end this documentary with the suggestion that mainstream scholarship has answered every question about the human past. It has not. The past is vast, and our knowledge of it, while impressive, is incomplete. There are genuine mysteries, real puzzles, real gaps in the record, real questions that remain unanswered. We do not know with certainty how the first humans reached some of the most remote Pacific islands. The broad outlines of Polynesian migration are well established, but many details remain unclear. How did navigators identify and locate tiny islands in the vast Pacific? How many voyages of exploration ended in failure, in death at sea, in landfall on barren, uninhabitable rocks? How was navigational knowledge transmitted from generation to generation, and how much was lost when European colonialism disrupted traditional Polynesian culture? We do not know the full story of the Indus Valley civilization. Its script remains undeciphered. Its political organization, its religious beliefs, and the reasons for its decline are still debated. The Indus Valley is one of the great unsolved puzzles of world archaeology, and it will remain so until or unless the script is cracked. We do not know everything about the construction of the Great Pyramid. While the general methods are understood, quarrying, transporting, and stacking limestone blocks, many details remain uncertain. How were the blocks lifted to the upper levels? How was the interior structure planned and executed? How was the construction project managed and organized? These are real questions, and they are the subject of ongoing research. We do not know the full extent of the changes wrought by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters, inundating vast areas of coastal land and burying countless archaeological sites beneath the waves. It is entirely possible, indeed, it is likely that significant human settlements were lost to the sea during this period, settlements that we may never be able to study because they lie beneath meters of water and sediment. These are genuine unknowns, and they deserve our attention and our curiosity. But there is a crucial difference between acknowledging genuine uncertainty and filling that uncertainty with fantasy. The fact that we do not know everything about the past does not mean that any story about the past is equally valid. The fact that there are gaps in the archaeological record does not mean that those gaps can be filled with lost continents and sunken civilizations. Genuine uncertainty demands humility, patience, and rigorous investigation, not wild speculation. The legend of Mu exploits genuine uncertainty. It takes the real gaps in our knowledge and fills them with a story that is emotionally satisfying but evidentially empty. It says, you don't know everything about the past and therefore my theory might be true. But this is a non sequitur. The fact that we don't know everything does not mean that we know nothing. We know a great deal about the past, and what we know is more than sufficient to rule out the existence of a sunken continent in the Pacific Ocean. Chapter 37, The Archaeology of the Future. One of the most exciting aspects of modern archaeology is the development of new technologies that are constantly expanding our ability to study the past. These technologies offer the promise of resolving many of the genuine mysteries that remain, and they also provide ever more powerful tools for debunking pseudohistorical claims. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has revolutionized the study of ancient landscapes. By firing millions of laser pulses from aircraft and measuring the reflections, LiDAR can create detailed three-dimensional maps of the ground surface, even through dense forest canopy. LiDAR surveys in Central and South America have revealed vast networks of previously unknown Maya cities, roads, and agricultural features, dramatically expanding our understanding of the scale and complexity of Maya civilization. Similar surveys in Southeast Asia have revealed the true extent of Angkor, the great Khmer city in Cambodia, which turns out to have been far larger and more complex than anyone had previously imagined. These discoveries are relevant to the Mu debate because they demonstrate that the real past is far richer and more complex than we thought, and they provide entirely naturalistic explanations for the scale and sophistication of ancient civilizations. The Maya did not need help from Mu to build their cities. Their cities were even more impressive than we knew. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of human migration and population history. By extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient bones and teeth, researchers can trace the movements of human populations across the globe with a precision that was unimaginable a generation ago. Ancient DNA studies have confirmed the Southeast Asian origin of the Polynesians, traced the migrations of ancient populations across every inhabited continent, and resolved long-standing debates about the relationships between ancient and modern peoples. Critically, ancient DNA studies have found no evidence of a mysterious, white race spreading civilization across the globe. The genetic evidence is clear. The great civilizations of the ancient world were built by the ancestors of the people who live in those regions today. The Egyptians were built by people of northeastern African ancestry. The Maya were built by people of indigenous Mesoamerican ancestry. The Polynesians are descended from Southeast Asian populations. There is no genetic trace of Churchward's white Muans. Underwater archaeology, the study of submerged sites using diving, remote-operated vehicles, and sonar, has also advanced enormously in recent decades. Underwater archaeologists have explored shipwrecks, submerged settlements, and drowned landscapes around the world, providing detailed information about sites that were once above sea level and are now beneath the waves. If a continent had existed in the Pacific and had sunk within the last 12,000 years, underwater archaeology would be capable of finding its remains. The technology exists, the will to look exists, and the result of looking is always the same. There is no trace of a sunken continent. The Pacific Ocean floor is exactly what plate tectonic theory predicts it to be, a basaltic crust produced at mid-ocean ridges, devoid of continental material. Chapter 38, What Mu Can Teach Us. We have spent many hours now examining the legend of Mu, its origins, its claims, its evidence, and its debunking. We have followed the story from the jungles of the Yucatan to the temples of India, from the depths of the Pacific to the pages of Churchward's books, from the age of empires to the age of the internet. And we have concluded, firmly and without reservation, that Mu did not exist. But the legend of Mu, for all its falsity, is not without value. It can teach us important things not about the past, but about ourselves. It can teach us about the power of narrative. Human beings are storytelling animals, and the stories we tell shape the way we see the world. The story of Mu is a reminder that a well-told story can be more persuasive than a mountain of evidence, and that this persuasive power can be used to deceive as well as to enlighten. It can teach us about the importance of critical thinking. The story of Mu reminds us that we cannot take claims at face value, no matter how confident the claimant, how compelling the narrative, or how satisfying the conclusion. We must always ask, what is the evidence? Can it be independently verified? Are there alternative explanations? What does the consensus of qualified experts say? These questions are not just useful for evaluating claims about lost continents. They are essential for navigating every aspect of modern life. It can teach us about the dangers of confirmation bias. Churchward found evidence for Mu everywhere he looked because he was looking for it. This is a universal human tendency, and it affects all of us in every area of our lives. Being aware of confirmation bias does not eliminate it, but it can help us guard against it by reminding us to actively seek out evidence that challenges our beliefs, not just evidence that confirms them. It can teach us about the value of genuine scholarship. The real history of the Pacific, of Egypt, of India, of Mesoamerica, as revealed by decades of careful, painstaking, evidence-based research, is infinitely richer, more complex, and more fascinating than anything Churchward ever imagined. The work of real scholars, archaeologists, linguists, geologists, geneticists, deserves our attention, our respect, and our support. These are the people who are actually uncovering the truth about the past, and their work is one of the great intellectual achievements of our species. And finally, the legend of Mu can teach us about the irreducible mystery of existence. The fact that Mu did not exist does not mean that the past holds no mysteries. The past is full of mysteries, genuine, unsolved, tantalizing mysteries that are waiting to be investigated. The origin of language, the meaning of the Indus Valley script, the purpose of Göbekli Tepe, the navigational methods of the Polynesians, the reason for the collapse of the Maya Classic period civilization. These are real questions, and they are worth pursuing not with the methods of pseudohistory, but with the tools of science and scholarship. Chapter 39, The Ocean SBAKS. Let us end where we began, with the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is the largest single feature on the face of the Earth. It stretches from the frozen shores of the Arctic to the ice-shelved coasts of Antarctica, from the volcanic islands of East Asia to the wave-battered coastlines of the Western Hemisphere's Pacific Rim. It is home to the deepest place on the planet, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, where the ocean floor lies nearly 11 kilometers below the surface. It contains more water than all of the other oceans combined. And it has been, for thousands of years, the home of some of the most remarkable peoples in human history. The Pacific does not need a lost continent to make it interesting. Its real history is more compelling than any fantasy. In the warm, shallow waters of the Western Pacific, the Lapita people, the ancestors of the Polynesians, built the first great maritime civilization, developing the outrigger canoe, the sail, and the navigational techniques that would carry their descendants across the largest ocean on Earth. On the island of Pohnpei, the Saudeleur dynasty built Nan Madol, a city of stone and water, a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of Pacific Island peoples. On Easter Island, the Rapa Nui people carved the moai, hundreds of enormous stone figures, staring inland from the island's coast, guardians of a culture that endured for centuries in one of the most remote places on Earth. In Hawaii, Polynesian settlers created a complex agricultural society with sophisticated irrigation systems, a hierarchical social structure, and a rich tradition of oral literature, music, and dance. In New Zealand, the Maori built a warrior culture of extraordinary vitality, with carved meeting houses, war canoes, and a tradition of oratory that is one of the great art forms of the Pacific. These are the real stories of the Pacific. They are stories of courage, creativity, and resilience. They are stories of human beings confronting the vast, indifferent ocean and making it their own. They do not need a lost continent to give them meaning. They are meaningful in themselves, and they are true. Chapter 40, Final Words. The continent that never was the lost continent of Mu is one of the great fantasies of the modern world. Born from a mistranslation, nurtured by colonial arrogance, elaborated by a self-taught visionary with a gift for storytelling, and kept alive by the deep human hunger for mystery and meaning, it has captured the imagination of millions and refuses to die, despite the overwhelming weight of evidence against it. Mu did not exist. There was never a continent in the Pacific Ocean. There was never a civilization of 64 million white-skinned people worshipping the sun and mastering cosmic forces. There were never Naacal tablets, never a Naacal language, never a brotherhood of priests preserving the secret knowledge of a sunken motherland. These things are inventions, the products of a fertile imagination operating in a world that was hungry for grand narratives and short on critical scrutiny. But the legend of Mu, precisely because it is false, can teach us something true, something important about who we are, how we think, and what we need. We are creatures who hunger for meaning. We are creatures who see patterns in the chaos and construct stories to make sense of the incomprehensible. We are creatures who mourn what is lost and dream of what might have been. We are creatures who sometimes prefer a beautiful lie to an uncomfortable truth, and who must constantly struggle against this preference if we are to understand the world as it actually is. The real world, the world revealed by science, by archaeology, by careful and honest inquiry, is not a diminished world. It is not a world robbed of mystery or wonder by the cold light of reason. It is a world of astonishing complexity, beauty, and depth, a world in which the real achievements of real peoples are more remarkable than anything ever dreamed up in the pages of a pseudo-historical fantasy. The pyramids of Egypt were not built by refugees from a lost Pacific continent. They were built by Egyptians, tens of thousands of skilled workers, organized by a sophisticated state, laboring for years in the desert heat to create monuments that have endured for 4.5 millennia. That is more impressive than Mu. The Maya did not receive their knowledge from overseas missionaries. They developed it themselves, creating a writing system, a mathematical notation, an astronomical tradition, and an architectural style that are among the most sophisticated achievements of the human mind. That is more impressive than Mu. The Polynesians did not inherit their navigational skills from a sunken motherland. They invented them, developing, over centuries of practical experience, a system of wayfinding so precise and so elegant that it has no equal in the history of exploration. That is more impressive than Mu. The real past does not need embellishment. It does not need lost continents or ancient aliens or secret brotherhoods. It needs only to be seen clearly without the distorting lens of fantasy for its true grandeur to become apparent, and yet the dream of Mu persists. It persists because we are human, and because being human means living with an irreducible sense of loss. A sense that something has gone missing from the world, that there is a gap between what is and what should be, that somewhere, somehow, the key to a better world lies buried in the ruins of the past. This feeling is not wrong. Something has been lost. We have lost species, ecosystems, languages, cultures, and ways of life that can never be recovered. We have lost the innocence of a world that seemed, in memory, simpler and more whole than the one we inhabit now. We have lost, in many cases, our connection to the traditions and the knowledge of our own ancestors. But the answer to this loss is not to invent a fictional past. It is to honor the real one, to study it, to learn from it, to celebrate its achievements and mourn its tragedies, and to carry its lessons forward into the future. The continent of Mu never existed. But the ocean that was supposed to have swallowed it is real. The islands that dot its surface are real. The peoples who have called those islands home for thousands of years are real, and their story, the story of how human beings, armed with nothing but courage, knowledge, and an unquenchable curiosity about the world beyond the horizon, crossed the greatest ocean on earth and made it their home, is one of the greatest stories ever told. It is a story that needs no embellishment. It needs no lost continents, no secret tablets, no vanished civilizations. It needs only to be told honestly and fully for its power to be felt. The waters of the Pacific keep their secrets, but the secrets they keep are not the ruins of a sunken paradise. They are the records of a living world, a world of currents and storms, of coral reefs and ocean trenches, of whales and dolphins and fish beyond counting, of islands that rise from the deep and slowly, over millions of years, return to it. This is the real Pacific, vast, beautiful, indifferent, and endlessly fascinating. And it is enough. It has always been enough. The continent of Mu was a dream, but the ocean that was imagined to cover it is a reality more magnificent than any dream. And if we can learn to see the real world with the same wonder and awe that we bring to our fantasies of lost civilizations, we may find that the truth, for all its complexity and ambiguity, is the greatest story of all. The waters close over the dream of Mu. The Pacific stretches on, as it always has, from horizon to horizon, keeping its real secrets beneath waves that care nothing for the stories we tell about them. And somewhere out there, on a tiny island in the middle of that vast, blue immensity, a navigator looks up at the stars, reads the swell of the ocean, feels the wind on their face, and knows with a certainty that no lost continent, no secret tablet, no ancient brotherhood could ever provide exactly where they are and exactly where they are going. That is the real miracle of the Pacific, and it was never lost.